Number 1. The disappearance of D.B. Cooper. On the night of November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man carrying a black briefcase walked into the Portland International Airport and purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport under the name Dan Cooper, a pseudonym that would later be misreported by the media as D.B. Cooper, becoming a moniker by which he would be eternally known. He was described as a man in his mid-40s, wearing a dark business suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and a mother-of-pearl tie clip, looking every bit the typical mid-century American businessman, save for the fact that he was about to execute one of the most audacious and baffling crimes in aviation history. He boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a Boeing 727, carrying 36 other passengers and 6 crew members, and took seat 18E in the rear of the cabin, a location that would allow him to observe the movements of the flight attendants and maintain a tactical advantage. Once the aircraft was airborne and the fasten seatbelt sign had been turned off, Cooper calmly handed a note to a young flight attendant named Florence Schaffner, who, assuming it was a phone number or a polite pass, tucked it into her pocket without reading it. Cooper leaned forward and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note, typed in neat capital letters, read, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." Schaffner, complied with his demands, sat in the adjacent seat as Cooper opened his briefcase just enough for her to see a mass of red cylinders attached to wires and a large battery, convincing her that the threat was real and imminent. Cooper's demeanor was not one of the frantic aggression often associated with criminal acts, but rather a chilling, polite calm that unnerved the crew as much as his demands. He dictated his specific requirements to Schaffner, ordering her to write them down. He wanted $200,000 in negotiable American currency, in $20 bills, and 4 parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve. He insisted that the parachutes be delivered to the aircraft upon landing in Seattle, and that the fueling trucks be ready to refuel the plane immediately. Upon landing, the plane was to remain on the ground, isolated from the terminal, with the curtains drawn to prevent law enforcement from seeing inside. Schaffner conveyed the message to the cockpit, and Captain William Scott, a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience, immediately contacted air traffic control to relay the hijacking situation. The news sent shockwaves to the Federal Aviation Administration and the FBI, who quickly mobilized a massive response, knowing that they were dealing with a situation that had no precedent in commercial aviation history. As Flight 305 continued toward Seattle, Cooper ordered his meal, a bourbon and water, which he sipped slowly, and smoked cigarettes, engaging occasional, low-key conversation with the flight attendants, revealing nothing of his background or motive beyond the meticulous execution of his plan. On the ground in Seattle, the situation was chaotic but highly organized. FBI agents, led by Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, scrambled to meet Cooper's demands, believing that the fastest way to resolve the situation safely was to give him exactly what he wanted. They gathered the $200,000 in $20 bills from various Seattle banks, taking the precautionary step of recording the serial numbers of every single bill, a move that would prove crucial in the ensuing investigation, but ultimately futile in identifying the culprit. They also obtained the 4 parachutes from a local skydiving school and the McCord Air Force Base. Cooper had specifically requested civilian parachutes rather than military ones, which he likely knew could be rigged with safety devices that would prevent a solo jump, a detail that suggested a level of technical knowledge about parachuting or military equipment. At approximately 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 landed in Seattle and taxied to a remote, well-lit area of the tarmac, as instructed. Captain Scott opened the cockpit window to receive the ransom money and parachutes from an FBI agent dressed in airline coveralls to avoid alarming Cooper, who was watching from the cabin. Once the items were aboard, Cooper allowed all passengers and most of the crew to disembark, keeping only the flight attendants and the cockpit crew as hostages. He instructed the pilots to refuel the plane and prepare for takeoff, setting a new course for Mexico City, but with specific navigational instructions. He wanted the aircraft to fly at a low altitude, no higher than 10,000 feet, and at a relatively slow airspeed of around 170 knots, conditions that were necessary for a safe jump from the rear stairway of a Boeing 727. As the refueling took place, Cooper's plan began to unfold with terrifying precision. He retreated to the rear of the cabin, where he tied a sack of money around his waist, donned one of the parachutes, and reportedly lowered the rear air stair of the 727, a unique feature known as the tail cone stairs, which could be open in flight. Around 7:40 p.m., the aircraft took off from Seattle, headed south through the darkness of a rainy, stormy night. The weather was severe, with heavy clouds, turbulence, and rain reducing visibility to almost zero, creating a hazardous environment for even the most experienced skydiver. The flight path took them over the densely forested, mountainous terrain of southwestern Washington, an area known for its rugged wilderness and treacherous landscape. Approximately 20 minutes after takeoff, around 8:13 p.m., the crew in the cockpit noticed a warning light indicating that the rear air stair had been deployed and felt a slight change in air pressure. In the cabin, a flight attendant saw Cooper tie a cord around his waist, connecting himself to the bag of cash, and then, without a word of farewell or a glance back, he opened the door and descended the stairs into the black abyss of the night. The moment he stepped off, the aircraft lurched upward, relieved of his weight, and the crew realized that the hijacker was gone. Captain Scott contacted air traffic control to report that Cooper had jumped, initiating one of the largest and most intensive manhunts in American history. The immediate search operation was massive, involving the United States Air Force, the United States Army, the Oregon National Guard, and countless local law enforcement agencies. They employed helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and ground teams to scour the projected landing zone, which had been calculated based on the aircraft's speed, altitude, wind direction, and the time of the jump. However, the stormy weather and the rugged, inaccessible terrain made the search nearly impossible. For days, they combed the forest around the Lewis River and the Columbia River, but found no trace of Cooper, no parachute, and no sign of the ransom money. The operation was hampered by the fact that the exact point of the jump was difficult to determine, and the weather had likely washed away any forensic evidence. As the days turned into weeks with no solid leads, the FBI began to question whether Cooper could have survived the jump. The 727 was flying faster than the recommended speed for a parachute jump, and the temperature at that altitude was below freezing. Furthermore, jumping into a dark, forested wilderness in the middle of a storm with a heavy bag of money tied to his waist would have been suicidal for anyone without elite military training and nerves of steel. Yet, the lack of a body meant that the possibility of survival remained open, keeping the mystery alive and the public captivated. Months after the hijacking, the investigation took a surprising turn when a young boy named Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family on the banks of Columbia River, near a place called Tinabar, about 9 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. While playing in the sand, Ingram discovered 3 bundles of waterlogged, decomposing $20 bills. His parents turned the money over to police, where it was confirmed to be part of the Cooper ransom. The serial numbers matched perfectly, and the total amounted to $5,880. This discovery was the first tangible piece of evidence linking Cooper to the physical world, but it raised more questions than it answered. The money had been found on a riverbank, suggesting that if Cooper had buried the money or if it had fallen into the river, the currents had carried it downstream. The condition of the bills indicated that they had been buried in the sand for some time, protected from complete disintegration, which led to theories that Cooper might have stashed the money there before disappearing, or that he had drowned and the money had floated free while his body remained trapped in the riverbed or was swept out to sea. This find narrowed the search area slightly, but also introduced the possibility that Cooper had not survived the landing and had perished in an inhospitable environment, leaving only the cash as a grim reminder of his demise. Over the years, the investigation, codenamed Norjack, Northern Hijack, generated hundreds of suspects, each with their own plausible connections to crime and their own fatal flaws in the profile. One of the most prominent suspects was John List, a New Jersey accountant who murdered his family and disappeared shortly before the hijacking, hoping to fake his own death and start a new life. List matched the general physical description and had the intelligence to pull off such a scheme, but he lacked the specific aviation knowledge and had no apparent link to the Pacific Northwest. Another strong suspect was Richard McCoy, a former Army helicopter pilot and convicted criminal who executed a similar hijacking less than 5 months after Cooper's crime, demanding $500,000 and parachuting out of 727 over Utah. McCoy was eventually captured after the serial numbers were recorded, and a fingerprint was found on a magazine he had handled on the plane. However, McCoy did not match the physical description of Cooper as closely as others, and his behavior during his own hijacking was more erratic and less controlled than Cooper's methodical approach. McCoy was killed in a shootout with FBI agents in 1974, and while some speculated that he could have been Cooper, the FBI ultimately ruled him out, citing significant differences in MO and physical characteristics. Perhaps the most intriguing suspect was Dwayne Weber, a man who confessed to his wife on his deathbed in 1995, saying, "I'm Dan Cooper." Weber had a criminal record, including a history of theft and prison escapes, and his wife, Jo, claimed that he had a scar on his knee from a jump injury and had owned a parachute. She also recalled that he had nightmares about falling from a plane and that they had visited the Columbia River area shortly before his death. Weber's physical description bore resemblance to the composite sketches drawn from the witnesses' descriptions, and his timeline seemed to fit, as he was known to be in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s. However, like all other suspects, there was no definitive evidence linking Weber to the crime. His fingerprints did not match those found on the plane, and his DNA could not be conclusively tied to the cigarette butts Cooper had smoked. The FBI investigated Joe Weber's claims extensively, but ultimately closed the case without naming a definitive suspect, leaving the question of Dwayne Weber's guilt unanswered, like so many others. The technical aspect of the hijacking have been dissected by aviation experts, skydivers, and forensic scientists for decades. The decision to use the Boeing 727 was central to Cooper's plan, as it was one of the few commercial aircraft with a tail air stair that could be open in flight. Following the hijacking, the FAA mandated the installation of a device known as the Cooper vane, a mechanical latch that prevented the rear stair from being deployed while the aircraft was in the air, effectively ending the era of such skyjackings. The mystery of how Cooper survived, if he did, remains a subject of intense debate. The consensus among experts is that the jump was incredibly risky, bordering on suicidal. The parachute he used was a standard Navy NB-6 backpack parachute, which required a static line for a safe deployment, but he had asked for a manual deployment parachute, which is much more difficult to use, especially at night and in stormy weather. Furthermore, he was wearing a suit and street shoes, not the specialized gear a skydiver would wear for such a jump. The weight of the money, approximately 21 pounds, would have thrown off his balance and potentially caused the parachute to malfunction or spin uncontrollably. Despite these nearly insurmountable odds, the lack of a body or confirmed crash site forces investigators to consider that he might have beaten the odds. The cultural impact of the D.B. Cooper case is undeniable. He became a folk hero to some, a symbol of rebellion against the establishment and the ultimate underdog who stuck it to the system and got away with it. The image of the cool, calm hijacker stepping out into the night with a bag of cash has been romanticized in songs, movies, and books, cementing his place in American mythology. Yet, for the FBI and the families of those involved, it was a serious criminal act that endangered lives and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in investigative resources. The case remained open for over 45 years, making it one of the longest-running active investigations in the Bureau's history. In 2016, the FBI officially announced that it was suspending the active investigation, shifting resources to other priorities, though they emphasized that the case remains technically open and that they will review any credible new evidence that might surface. The physical evidence, including the tie Cooper left behind on the plane, is preserved in the FBI's laboratory, waiting for the advent of technology that might unlock the secrets held within the microscopic traces of DNA. The mystery endures because it is the perfect crime. It was committed in a confined space, in full view of witnesses, yet the perpetrator vanished into thin air, leaving behind almost nothing but a pseudonym and a few stacks of soggy cash. The vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest has swallowed him whole, keeping his fate a secret. Every year, enthusiasts and amateur sleuths trek into the forests of Washington, hoping to find a bone, a scrap of fabric, or the rusting buckle of a parachute that would finally solve the puzzle. Some believe he never made it, that he is buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the mountains, a victim of his own hubris. Others believe he lived out his life in some foreign country or under a new identity in the American Midwest, spending his days in quiet anonymity, laughing at the world that searched for him in vain. The truth, as with so many great mysteries, likely lies somewhere in the gray area between these extremes, loss of time and the elements. The legend of D.B. Cooper serves as a reminder of the limits of law enforcement and the enduring power of the unknown, a story that continues to haunt the American imagination because it was never truly finished. It is a case where a final chapter was never written, a story interrupted mid-sentence, leaving the audience to forever wonder about the fate of the man who jumped into the dark and was never seen again. Number 2, the Isdal Woman. In the stark, breathtaking landscape of Bergen, Norway, where the jagged peaks of the mountains meet the gray waters of the fjords, a discovery was made on the morning of November 29, 1970, that would ignite one of the most perplexing mysteries in Scandinavian history. A university professor and his 2 young daughters were hiking along a popular trail known as the Death Path, or Isdalen, a scenic yet foreboding route near Mount Ulriken. As they traversed the rocky terrain, one of the girls spotted something unusual lying among the scree and sparse vegetation near the foot of a rock formation called Isdalsøysen. Initially, the professor thought it might be a discarded mannequin or a pile of rags left behind by careless campers, but upon closer inspection, the horrific reality became clear. It was the body of a woman, burned almost beyond recognition. She was lying on her back, her hands folded across her chest in a peculiar, ritualistic manner, and she was completely naked except for a pair of rubber boots, her clothes having been carefully arranged and burned in a pile nearby. The scene was immediately disturbing, not just for the gruesome nature of the death, but for the distinct sense of order and calm that surrounded the corpse, suggesting that whoever had placed her there had done so with purpose and precision. The local police arrived quickly, sealing off the area, but the harsh Norwegian weather in the exposed location made the preservation of evidence difficult. The fire had been intense, consuming much of the woman's flesh and obliterating any immediate identifying features. Her fingerprints had been burned off, a clear indication that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure she could not be identified. In her pockets, investigators found a curious assortment of items: a broken pair of sunglasses, a silver spoon, remnants of a plastic bottle that once contained gasoline, and 2 bottles of a strong sleeping potion, Phenomel. Most intriguingly, they found a small scrap of paper that had somehow survived the inferno, printed with the coded words Isdal 5. The position of the body, with arms outstretched or folded depending on the initial report, and the systematic burning of her clothes, pointed not to a random act of violence, but to a calculated effort to erase a person from existence. The woman had no identification, no passport, and no luggage. She was a ghost, a Jane Doe in a country where such mysteries were exceedingly rare, and her presence in the remote valley posed more questions than answers. An autopsy was conducted at the Gate Institute in Bergen, and the results only deepened the enigma. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was not the fire itself, but rather carbon monoxide poisoning and a massive overdose of the sleeping pills found in her pocket. Her blood contained a lethal concentration of Phenomel, suggesting that she had been heavily sedated before the fire was set. There were also significant burns on her neck and front, but her back was relatively unscathed, indicating she may have been unconscious or already dead when the flames were lit. Perhaps most chillingly, the analysis revealed that she had taken at least 50 to 70 pills in total, a quantity that defies normal suicide attempts and points to a forced administration or a desperate, prolonged self-medication. Toxicology reports also showed traces of a tranquilizer, suggesting a complex cocktail of drugs was used to incapacitate her. The examination of her stomach revealed the presence of unburnt pin bones from a type of fish called a collie, a cheap variety common in the local area, which gave investigators a vital clue about her activities in the hours leading up to her death. She had eaten the meal shortly before dying, placing her at a local cafe or restaurant. As the news of the Isdal Woman, as she was dubbed by the press, spread across Norway, the police launched a massive investigation to uncover her identity. They released a composite sketch based on the skeletal structure of her skull, depicting a woman with high cheekbones and a distinct facial structure. The sketch was published in newspapers across Europe and North America, leading to hundreds of tips from the public. Witnesses began to come forward, placing a woman matching her description in various locations around Bergen in the weeks prior to her death. She was seen checking into several hotels under different names, always paying in cash and speaking multiple languages, including French, German, English, and Flemish. Hotel staff describe her as elegant, well-dressed, and attractive, roughly between 25 and 40 years old, standing around 5 feet 4 inches tall. She had brown hair, wide-set eyes, and a prominent scar on her chin, a detail that had survived the fire. Those who encountered her noted her peculiar behavior. She was friendly but guarded, often changing rooms and seemingly avoiding contact with other guests. She was a woman traveling alone, moving like a shadow through the tourist hubs of Norway, meticulously covering her tracks. The investigation took a significant turn when police discovered 2 suitcases that had been left at the Bergen railway station. They had been checked into storage on November 23rd, 6 days before the body was found, and were never retrieved. Inside the suitcases, investigators found a wardrobe of high-quality clothing, a beige raincoat, a blue blouse, a pink pullover, and several pairs of shoes. The labels had been meticulously cut out of every single garment, a tedious task that underscored the desperate need for anonymity. Among the clothes were a prescription bottle for a lotion to treat skin eczema, a tube of cream for a foot fungus, and a pack of cigarettes, German brand R6, with a fingerprint that did not match the Interpol database. Forensic scientists analyzed the clothing and found traces of pollen in the cuffs of the trousers and the hem of the dress. This pollen was traced back to plants native to southern Europe, specifically regions in France, Switzerland, and Italy. This finding suggested that the woman had spent considerable time in these areas before arriving in Norway, potentially living there or traveling extensively. It was the first solid lead in determining her geographic origin. Further digging into the suitcases revealed a hidden secret. A forensic technician discovered a secret pocket sewn into the lining of one of the bags. Inside this pocket, they found 500 Deutsche marks, about 130 Norwegian kroner, and, crucially, 2 scraps of paper. One was a receipt for laundry services in St. Gallen, Switzerland, dated March 1968. The other was a piece of paper with a cryptic notation, Pierre. These items provided a tangible link to the continent. The Swiss police were brought in to assist, and they found that the laundry receipt bore a serial number that was often given to the local hotels, suggesting the woman had been a guest at a hotel in St. Gallen. This trail of breadcrumbs led investigators to believe that the woman was professional, possibly a spy or an intelligence asset, given her linguistic skills, her ability to blend in, and the extreme measures taken to hide her identity. The Cold War was at its peak in 1970, and Norway was a strategic NATO member bordering the Soviet Union, making it a hotbed for espionage activity. The theory that she was a spy caught in a deadly game became a dominant narrative. As the police retraced her steps through hotel registries, a pattern emerged. She had arrived in Norway via flight from Copenhagen, but before that, she had traveled through Switzerland, France, and possibly Italy. She used at least 8 different false identities, names like Claudia Tielt, Veronica Durack, and Alexia Zanaret. Many of these names were linked to addresses in major cities like Paris, Brussels, and Oslo, but when police investigated these addresses, they turned out to be fake or belonged to unsuspecting residents who had never heard of the woman. She was a master of disguise, not just physically, but administratively, weaving a web of false identities that was nearly impenetrable. Witnesses at the hotels recalled that she often ate at her restaurant, paying with cash, and spent her days looking at maps or taking buses into mountains. On the day of her death, November 23rd, she had checked into the Hotel Horteheimen in Bergen. She asked for a room with a view and seemed nervous. The next day, she checked out, but left her luggage at the station. 2 days later, she was seen hiking near Isdal with a man described as being in his 40s, wearing a trench coat and a hat. They were seen having a heated argument, with the woman appearing distressed. This was the last confirmed sighting of the Isdal Woman alive. The man in the trench coat became the prime suspect, or at least the last person known to have seen her. Despite an intensive search, he was never identified, and no one came forward to claim they knew him. Some theories suggested he was a handler or a partner who had betrayed her. Others speculated that he was a target she was tracking, and their encounter had turned fatal. The burned body scene, with its ritualistic layout, fueled rumors of a mafia-style execution or a spy liquidation designed to send a message. The removal of labels and the burning of fingerprints were hallmarks of professional tradecraft. In the 1970s, Europe was rife with intelligence activity, with the CIA, KGB, MI6, and various European agencies operating in the shadows. Norway's location made it a critical listening post. If the Isdal Woman was a spy, she had been burned in the most literal sense, sacrificed to protect operations or compromise assets. Decades passed, and the case went cold, filed away in the archives of the Bergen Police Department, only to be revisited by amateur detectives and journalists obsessed with the mystery. In 2002, a Bergen resident named Tormod Orhog, who had been a young policeman at the time of the discovery, gave an interview recalling the case. He mentioned that the woman had distinctive teeth, specifically gold fillings, which was a detail that had not been widely publicized. In 2005, a new forensic examination was conducted on the remains, which had been buried in a grave in the churchyard of Melendal in Bergen. The exhumation aimed to utilize modern DNA technology and isotope analysis to learn more about her origins. The isotopes from her teeth revealed that she had likely spent her childhood in Europe, possibly near the border of France and Germany. This corroborated the pollen evidence, but failed to pinpoint a specific town or family. The DNA was extracted and added to international databases, but no match was ever found. She remained without a name, without a family, and without a history. In 2016, the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, NRK, launched a comprehensive podcast and documentary series titled Death in Ice Valley, which brought the Isdal Woman back into the international spotlight. The investigation team re-examined the evidence, interviewed aging witnesses, and utilized new genetic genealogy techniques. They even tested the DNA of a Belgian man who believed the Isdal Woman might be his missing sister, but the results were negative. The podcast generated a wave of new tips, but none that provided the definitive breakthrough needed to close the case. One of the most poignant theories to emerge was that she was a victim of human trafficking or a high-level prostitution ring, which would explain the travel, the false names, and the extreme need for secrecy, but the level of sophistication in her countermeasures suggested a higher level of organization than typical criminal syndicates usually employed with their victims. The most compelling piece of evidence that has survived is a set of photographs found among her belongings. In the 1970s, a photographer came forward claiming to have taken pictures of a woman matching the Isdal Woman's description at a hotel in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. The photos show a woman smiling, looking relaxed, holding a camera. It is one of the few images that might depict her as a living, breathing person, enjoying life rather than a corpse in a valley. Who she was looking at through the lens and who was behind the camera taking photos of her remains unknown. Was she traveling with a lover, a colleague, or was she truly, entirely alone in the world? The mystery of the Isdal Woman touches on deep-seated fears about identity and anonymity. The idea that a person can live, travel, and die without leaving a trace is terrifying in a modern world where surveillance is omnipresent. Her life was a carefully constructed facade, a performance for an audience that never saw her face. The tragic nature of her death, alone, drugged, and burned on a mountainside, evokes a profound sense of pity. Whoever she was, she clearly did not deserve to end up as a nameless specimen in a police morgue. The efforts to erase her identity were so successful that they may have erased her memory as well, leaving only the silhouette of a woman in her rubber boots, frozen in time. Today, the Isdal Woman rests in the Melendal Cemetery, her grave marked by a simple metal plate that reads Ukjen Kvinn, Unknown Woman. Flowers are occasionally left there by anonymous visitors, a silent tribute to the mystery she embodies. The case remains officially open with the Bergen police, who occasionally receive new tips. Advances in DNA technology, particularly the use of forensic genetic genealogy, solving cold cases by matching DNA to distant relatives on public genealogy websites, offer a glimmer of hope that one day she will be identified. Perhaps a cousin in Alsace or a nephew in Munich will one day upload their DNA, and the algorithm will finally bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Until then, the Isdal Woman remains eternal tourist, a traveler without a home, a woman who checked into life but never checked out, leaving behind a trail of counterfeit clues that lead nowhere, disappearing into the mist of Isdalen as if she were never there at all. Number 3. The Taman Shud case. On a crisp, warm morning in December 1948, the quiet tranquility of Somerton Beach in Adelaide, South Australia, was shattered when a jellyfish stinger discovered the body of a man lying on the sand near the Cremorne slip baths. The date was December 1st, and the location, a popular spot for morning swimmers, usually bustled with activity. But on this particular morning, the man lay unnoticed for some time. He was remarkably well dressed for a day at the beach, wearing a smart brown suit, a white shirt, a red tie, and polished brown shoes, with a brown knitted pullover draped over his shoulders. His head was resting against the seawall, and his legs were crossed, giving the initial impression that he might simply be a weary traveler sleeping off a night of revelry. However, as the sun rose higher and the stinger and a few passers-by approached, it became chillingly apparent that the man was dead. There were no signs of violence, no struggle, and no identification on his person. A half-smoked cigarette was perched precariously on his right collar, unburnt and ready to be smoked, suggesting he had died suddenly or was in a state of deep repose when the end came. This discovery marked the beginning of the Taman Shud case, a mystery that would baffle detectives, cryptographers, and the public for decades, earning the title of Australia's most profound mystery. When the police and ambulance arrived, a thorough search of the body yielded absolutely nothing in terms of identification. All the labels had been meticulously cut out as clothing, a detail that echoed the precautions of a spy or a criminal. Yet the man himself bore the appearance of a respectable, perhaps even athletic, middle-aged gentleman. He was estimated to be between 40 and 50 years old, standing about 5 feet 11 inches tall, with broad shoulders and a chest development that suggested he was physically fit, possibly a dancer or a laborer. His hands were smooth and unblemished, indicating he did not perform manual labor, and his tan was uniform, suggesting he had recently worn shorts or been in a climate where the sun was intense. In his pockets, the police found a used bus ticket from the city to Somerton and a used train ticket from the city to Henley Beach, a packet of chewing gum, a pack of Army Club cigarettes containing 7 cigarettes of a different brand called Kensitas, and an aluminum comb. It was a collection of mundane items that painted a picture of a man in transit, yet without a wallet, no driver's license, and no money other than the change used for the tickets. He was a ghost. The body was transported to the Royal Adelaide Hospital for an autopsy, conducted by the city pathologist, Dr. John Dwyer. The examination was as perplexing as the scene on the beach. Dr. Dwyer found that the man's heart was a normal size, but his spleen was enormously enlarged, roughly 3 times the size of a healthy organ. His liver was congested, and his stomach was filled with blood. There were no foreign bodies in his system, no obvious poisons that could be detected with the technology of the time, and the cause of death was ruled to be heart failure, likely induced by an unknown substance or a sudden physiological shock. The most baffling aspect was a lack of natural disease that could explain such a sudden death in a seemingly healthy man. Dr. Dwyer noted that the man's calf muscles were high and firm, characteristic of a dancer, specifically a ballet dancer, which added a layer of romantic intrigue to the victim's profile. Who was this dancing man who died alone on a beach with no name? Weeks passed, and the police were unable to identify the body despite releasing descriptions and photographs to the public. Then, in January 1949, a significant breakthrough occurred, or so it seemed. A man discovered a small brown suitcase in the railway station's cloakroom. It had been checked in on the afternoon of November 30th, the day before the body was found. Inside the suitcase were items consistent with the deceased's clothing, a red dressing gown, a pair of red slippers, pajamas, shaving gear, and a screwdriver. Once again, every single label had been carefully cut or torn away. Among the items was a distinctive orange singlet and a pair of trousers with repair done in a highly unusual technique. Alongside the clothes was a roll of orange thread identical to the thread used for repair and a stencil brush. The suitcase also contained a table knife that had been altered into a short, sharp instrument, suggesting a tool for cutting or perhaps self-defense. The lack of identification in the suitcase was deliberate and thorough, pointing to a calculated effort to obscure the owner's identity. However, the strangest clue in the suitcase was not the clothes or the makeshift knife, but a small slip of paper printed with the words Tamam Shud. These words are Persian, meaning ended or finished, and are typically found at the very end of a collection of poems by the 12th century Persian poet Omar Khayyam, known as the Rubaiyat. The discovery of this scrap of paper was a turning point of the case, transforming it from a simple, unexplained death into a cryptographic and literary puzzle. The police searched for a copy of the Rubaiyat that had this specific page torn out. In a stroke of incredible luck, or perhaps destiny, a man walked into police station a few days later claiming that he found a very rare first edition of Edward Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat in the back seat of his unlocked car, parked near the beach on the night of the death. When the police examined the book, they confirmed that the final page, the one containing Taman Shud, was missing, matching the torn paper found in the dead man's pocket. On the blank back cover of this rare book, detectives found faint pencil markings that appeared to be a coded message. It was a jumble of letters, grouped in fives, reading as follows: Vergobab, Mliawi, Tbimbanip, Emelawiki, in Sam's Gab. Below these lines was a crossed-out telephone number and an unfinished line that looked like MLIO. The code was baffling. Local cryptographers, intelligence officers from the Australian military, and even the FBI attempted to crack it, but no one could find a definitive meaning. Theories range from being a simple substitution cipher to a one-time pad used by spies. Some amateur sleuth suggested it was an initialism for a phrase like, "It's time to move to," but nothing conclusive ever emerged. The crossed-out phone number, however, was a solid lead. It belonged to a young nurse named Jessica Thompson, also known as Jessin in the press, who lived in a suburb just a few miles away from the beach. When police interviewed Jessica Thompson, she provided a lead that was both promising and frustratingly vague. She admitted to owning a copy of the Rubaiyat, but claimed she had given it to a man named Alfred Boxall during the war. Boxall was a lieutenant in the Australian Army, and Thompson had known him in Sydney in 1945. She told police that she had moved to Melbourne and then married, and Boxall had eventually left for Queensland. Crucially, when shown the plaster cast of the dead man's face, she claimed she did not recognize him and became visibly distressed, refusing to look at the image again. This reaction fueled speculation that she was lying, that she didn't know the man on the beach and was protecting his identity for reasons unknown. For years, the prevailing theory was that the dead man was Alfred Boxall, who had come to Adelaide to see her, and that their meeting had ended in tragedy. However, in 1949, the police tracked down Alfred Boxall in Queensland. He was very much alive, and when questioned, he produced his copy of the Rubaiyat, the complete copy with the Taman Shud page still intact. This revelation blew the case wide open. If the dead man wasn't Boxall, who was he? And why did he have a scrap of paper from a different copy of the same book that Jessica Thompson had given to another man? The connection was undeniable but circular. Jessica Thompson eventually moved away, changed her name, and refused to speak about the case for the rest of her life, taking the secret to her grave in 2007. Decades later, it was revealed that she had a son named Robin, who was born in 1947. The boy's father was never named on the birth certificate, and Jessica was reportedly estranged from her husband at the time of the birth. This led to the explosive theory that the Somerton man was Robin's biological father, and that his death was a result of a forbidden affair or a custody battle gone wrong. The investigation continued to stalling out, hampered by the lack of technology and the reticence of key witnesses. The body was embalmed using a special chemical compound to preserve it in case it needed to be identified later, and it was buried in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery in 1949. The burial itself was attended by scores of curious onlookers, and the grave was marked with a simple tombstone reading, "Unknown Somerton Body." Over the decades, the case attracted a cult following of amateur detectives, each proposing new theories ranging from Cold War espionage to a botched suicide pact. The proximity of the discovery to an artillery testing range and a secret weapons research facility in Adelaide led some to believe the man was a Soviet spy who had been poisoned, hence the enlarged spleen and lack of obvious cause of death. The code, they argued, was a secret message left by a handler. In 2009, the University of Adelaide launched an effort to extract DNA from the hair roots found in the plaster cast of the Somerton man's face. The hair was remarkably well preserved, and preliminary tests suggested that the man might have had a rare genetic marker linking him to the United States, specifically the region of Virginia. This opened up the possibility that he was an American serviceman or intelligence operative. In 2018, Professor Derek Abbott, an electrical engineer who had become obsessed with the case, identified the son of Jessica Thompson, Robin Thompson, who had died in 2009. Abbott successfully petitioned the Attorney General to exhume the Somerton man's body for advanced DNA testing. The exhumation took place in 2019, and the remains were subjected to extensive genomic analysis. In July 2022, the results were finally announced, bringing a monumental shift to the mystery, but not a total resolution. The DNA testing identified the summited man as Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker born in 1905 in a suburb of Melbourne. Webb had served in the Royal Australian Air Force during World War II, but had been discharged for unknown reasons. He was not a spy, at least not in the glamorous international sense. He was an ordinary man with a tragic family history. Records showed that he had married a woman named Dorothy Robertson in 1941, but the marriage had dissolved acrimoniously. Dorothy had taken out a restraining order against him in 1947, citing his erratic behavior and obsession with her. By 1948, Carl Webb had effectively disappeared from the historical record, his estrangement from his family so complete that no one had reported him missing or claimed his body. The identification of Carl Webb was a triumph of modern forensic science, closing the loop on who the man was, but opened the door to even deeper mysteries about his final days. If he was just a jilted husband from Melbourne, why was he in Adelaide? Why was he wearing a suit with no labels? Why the obsession with the Rebate and the cryptic code? The connection to Jessica Thompson, née Harkness, remained the strongest link. It turned out that Dorothy Webb, Carl's estranged wife, had a brother named Prosper Thompson, who was a man Jessica Thompson had married in 1950, after the death of the summited man. This familial link suggests that the summited man, Carl Webb, was related by marriage to Jessica Thompson. The theory now is that Webb traveled to Adelaide to confront or reconnect with his sister-in-law, perhaps over family matters or the impending marriage. The code might have been a personal message between them, or perhaps a desperate attempt to communicate his state of mind. The coroner's report in 2022 officially ruled that Carl Webb died by poisoning, likely via barbiturate, though the specific substance could not be determined due to the passage of time. The Taman Shud phrase, "it is ended," takes on a poignant new meaning in light of his failed marriage and disappearance. It may have been his own declaration at the end of his life, a final, dramatic statement of despair. However, the secrecy, the removed labels, and the complex web of interactions still suggest there is more to the story. Some researchers believe Webb was suffering from a mental illness that caused him to erase his identity and take his own life in a way that would confuse and torment those he left behind. Others hold on to the espionage theory, arguing that even ordinary engineers can be recruited for intelligence work, and his ordinary life might have been a cover. The mystery of the summited man has evolved from a whodunit to a whydunit. We know who he was, but the Taman Shud code and the exact nature of his relationship with Jessica Thompson remain subjects of intense debate. The code, analyzed with modern computational power, has still not been definitively cracked, leading some to believe it was simply the incoherent scrawling of a dying man. Yet, the specificity of the message, the crossed-out phone number, and the use of the rare book all imply a deliberate attempt to communicate. The case remains a testament to the enduring allure of the unknown, a snapshot of a post-war world filled with shadows, secrets, and people trying to reinvent themselves. Carl Webb, the summited man, lies now in a grave with a name, but the mystery of his final, lonely walk on Somerton Beach and the cryptic message he left behind ensures that he will never be truly forgotten. Number 4. The death of Chris Kremers and Lizen Frun. On the 15th of March, 2014, the lush, verdant landscape of Boquete, a tranquil town nestled in the highlands of Panama, played host to the arrival of two young Dutch women, Chris Kremers and Lizen Frun, who were eager to embrace a new chapter of their lives. Chris, age 21, was a recent university graduate with a passion for photography and the arts, possessing a creative and somewhat impulsive spirit that contrasted with the more grounded and pragmatic nature of Lizen, who was 22 years old and had just completed her studies in applied sciences. They had traveled to Panama with the intention of spending a month learning Spanish to better their prospects for future university studies back in the Netherlands, and they had arranged to live with a local host family, creating a home base from which they could explore the stunning natural beauty of the region. Their first few weeks in Panama were filled with the typical excitement of expatriates, adjusting to the climate, meeting new people, and documenting their adventures through photographs and social media posts that showed them smiling, happy, and ready for the journey that lay ahead, unaware that their trip would soon morph from a dream vacation into one of the most perplexing and harrowing mysteries in modern history. On the morning of April 1st, 2014, a clear and sunny day that belied the dense and unpredictable nature of surrounding terrain, Chris and Liz set out from the host family's home around 11 a.m. to hike a trail near the local landmark known as the Pianista Peak, a route that was popular among tourists and considered relatively safe, often used by locals and guided groups. They were dressed appropriately for a hike, wearing lightweight clothing and tennis shoes, and they had packed a backpack belonging to the host family's son with 2 water bottles, a small digital camera, Lizanne's iPhone, and Chris's iPhone. It was intended to be a short, day-long excursion to get a view of the Continental Divide from the summit, a hike that usually took about 3 to 4 hours round trip for a moderately fit person. They were last seen by a restaurant owner near the entrance to the trail around midday, appearing in high spirits as they began their ascent into Cloud Forest, a lush ecosystem characterized by high humidity, frequent mist, and dense vegetation that could quickly disorient even those who were familiar with the area. When the sun began to set that evening and the girls failed to return to the host family's home for dinner, a sense of unease began to settle in. Initially, their host family and the local guide they had contacted were not overly alarmed, assuming that the young women might have simply lost track of time or decided to stay overnight in a nearby lodge, a common occurrence for tourists who underestimate the trail's duration. However, as the hours ticked by and night fell over the jungle, the lack of communication became concerning. While Chris had brought her Dutch phone, it did not have a SIM card that worked in Panama, meaning the girls were relying on Lizanne's iPhone for any potential emergency calls. Yet no calls had been made. The following morning, April 2nd, the host family reported the girls missing to the local authorities, and a massive search and rescue operation was launched, involving the Dutch embassy, the Panamanian Civil Protection System, fire departments, police units, and hundreds of local volunteers who combed the dense forests and steep ravines surrounding Boquete. For 10 days, the search efforts were relentless and exhaustive, utilizing helicopters, tracking dogs, and specialized teams to scour the rugged terrain, which included deep ravines, fast-flowing rivers, and dense undergrowth that made progress agonizingly slow. The landscape around the Baru volcano is beautiful but treacherous, with slippery slopes and sudden drops that pose a significant danger to hikers who stray from the marked path. Despite the massive mobilization of resources and the widespread media attention the case garnered both in Panama and internationally, the search yielded absolutely no trace of Chris or Lizanne, no clothing, no footprints beyond the trailhead, and no sign of the backpack they had carried. It was as if the jungle had swallowed them whole, leaving their families in the Netherlands in a state of agonizing limbo, desperate for news and fearing the worst, but clinging to the hope that the girls had perhaps been kidnapped or had gotten lost, and were awaiting rescue in a remote part of the forest. The breakthrough in the case came on June 13th, 2014, more than 2 months after the girls had disappeared, when a local Ngay woman was washing clothes by the river bank near the village of Alto Romero, a significant distance downriver and deep within the indigenous territory, far from the hiking trail they had intended to walk. She spotted a blue backpack resting on a rock in the middle of the Culebra River and alerted the authorities. When the police recovered the backpack, they found that it was dry and in good condition, suggesting it had been placed there recently rather than having been tumbling down the river for weeks. Inside were the 2 iPhones belonging to the girls and Lizanne's Canon digital camera, as well as 2 pairs of sunglasses and some water bottles. The discovery of the backpack was the first solid lead investigators had, and the content within would provide a chilling, fragmented timeline of the girls' final days, yet the data would only serve to deepen the mystery rather than solve it, painting a picture of desperation, confusion, and unexplained events. Forensic analysis of the iPhones revealed a series of disturbing attempts to call emergency services that contradicted the initial belief that the girls had been lost immediately. The phone logs showed that for the first few days after their hike, starting on April 1st, there was little to no activity, but on April 2nd at 16:39, Lizanne's iPhone was used to dial the Panamanian emergency number 112. This call lasted only a few seconds and did not connect due to a lack of signal in the area. Following this, there was a series of frantic attempts between April 3rd and April 11th to dial 911 and 112, primarily using Lizanne's phone, which had better battery life or perhaps a stronger signal capability. In total, the phones registered 77 attempted calls, mostly in the early morning or late afternoon, suggesting the girls were awake and trying to get help during these times. But the signal strength was pitifully low, showing only fleeting bars of coverage that would have dropped the calls almost instantly. The fact that they were able to get a signal at all meant they were likely moving, or that the phone was being moved, in an attempt to find a location with a better connection to the cell tower near the summit. The digital camera found in the backpack contained over 100 photos, most of which were normal vacation snaps from the first few weeks of their trip in Panama City and Boquete. However, the final sequence of photos, taken on April 8th, a week after they were last seen, was deeply unsettling. The camera had been used to take a series of 90 photos during the night, in complete darkness, using the flash function to illuminate the surroundings. The images show a ravine and a dense forest, with some photos showing what appears to be the back of Chris's head with reddish, tangled hair, and others showing a twig with a plastic bag or candy wrapper attached to it. In one particularly haunting photo, a mirror is used to reflect a flash, perhaps in an attempt to signal rescuers or a helicopter, although no search flights were operating in that area at that specific time. The quality of the photos is poor, but they convey a palpable sense of fear and isolation. The fact that the camera was used a week into their disappearance indicates that both the phone and the camera were still in their possession, or at least accessible, on that date, and that they were still alive, albeit in a dire situation that left them wandering in the dark. The discovery of the backpack and the digital data shifted the search efforts to the area around Alto Romero and the riverbanks. A few days after the backpack was found, remains were discovered scattered along the same riverbank. A pelvis and a foot, still inside a boot, were found, later confirmed by DNA testing, to belong to Liz and Frun. 2 months later, in August, further remains were found upstream, including a hip bone and a jaw bone with teeth intact, which were identified as belonging to Chris Kremers. The condition of the remains was shocking. They were scattered over a wide area, and many bones were missing, including the skulls, which have never been found. This lack of skulls made it impossible to determine the cause of death, as there were no signs of trauma on the recovered bones. The state of the remains and the fact that the backpack was found intact and dry fueled a firestorm of speculation and conspiracy theories that raged on the internet and in the media for years to come. The official theory posited by the Panamanian authorities and accepted by the Dutch prosecutors, who closed the case in 2017, was that Chris and Liz fell victim to a tragic hiking accident. They speculated that the girls may have strayed from the main path onto a side trail, perhaps chasing a monkey or seeking a better view, and became disoriented in the dense, foggy cloud forest. As darkness fell, they attempted to return but ended up lost in the steep, treacherous terrain near the Mirador, a lookout point. The theory suggests that they eventually fell into a deep ravine or riverbed, possibly injuring themselves, which would explain the reddish hair seen in the photos and the lack of further movement after a certain date. They believe the girls survived for several days, suffering from dehydration and exposure, and that Chris, who appeared to be weaker or perhaps injured, died first, leaving Liz to place the backpack and the remains in a desperate, albeit futile, attempt to protect them from the elements or signal for help. The scattering of bones was attributed to the force of the river during the rainy season and the activity of scavengers in the area. However, the official accident theory has been heavily criticized by many, including the girls' families and independent forensic experts, due to a multitude of anomalies that simply do not add up. The placement of the backpack is the primary point of contention. How could a backpack end up on a dry rock months later in a location downstream, in such pristine condition, if the girls had fallen into a river upstream? If the bodies had been washed downriver, the backpack should have been waterlogged, torn, and covered in mud, yet was clean and dry. Furthermore, the photos taken on April 8th show the girls, or at least Chris, in a position that suggests they were not incapacitated in the ravine, but were moving. Yet there were no photos after that date. If they had the energy to hike and take photos for a week, why did they not continue moving toward civilization or find a clearing to signal? The sequence of emergency calls also raised questions. The phone usage stopped abruptly on April 11th, coinciding with the time the battery on Liz Ann's phone died. Did they give up, or did something happen to them on that specific day? Darker theories emerged, suggesting foul play or even criminal activity. The proximity of the area to known drug trafficking routes and the presence of criminal elements in the region led some to speculate that the girls might have stumbled upon something they shouldn't have or were attacked. The fact that Chris's jeans were found zipped but folded in a way that suggested they might have been taken off, and that Lizanne's remains were found inside a boot, while Chris's foot was found inside a boot, but the bones were scattered, fueled rumors of sexual assault or violence. Some investigators pointed to the alleged photos of the back of Chris's head, claiming the red tint was not hair but blood, implying a head injury. There were also whispers of potential cover-up involving the host family or locals, but no concrete evidence was ever found to support these claims, and a lack of defensive wounds on the bones made the theory of a violent struggle difficult to prove. Another layer of the mystery involves a local guide who was reportedly seen with the girls on the day they disappeared, though he vehemently denied being with them and passed a polygraph test. There were also reports of a Dutchman in the area who had offered to take them hiking, adding to the list of potential suspects or witnesses who might have had information about their route. The jungle itself is a place of secrets, capable of hiding evidence quickly, and the slow response time of the official search, which critics argue lacked coordination and urgency in the critical first 48 hours, undoubtedly hampered the chances of finding the girls alive. The frustration of the families was palpable as they felt the local police were ill-equipped to handle a missing persons case of this magnitude and were too quick to dismiss foul play to protect the region's tourism industry. The forensic analysis conducted in the Netherlands added another dimension to the mystery. The bone fragments found were tested for traces of lime or chemicals to see if the bodies had been tampered with, but the results were inconclusive. The skin found attached to the foot bones showed no signs of decomposition consistent with being submerged in water for 2 months, suggesting the foot may have been dry or protected. Yet it was found near the river. This anomaly led some experts to propose that the bodies had been placed in a river or on the banks at a later date, perhaps to simulate an accident. The theory of a crime scene cleanup was bolstered by the pristine condition of the backpack, which contained the cameras and phones, items of value that would likely have been taken by a robber or lost in a rushing torrent. The fact that the phones had been used to call emergency services for days, but then suddenly stopped, right when the battery died, implies that the person holding the phone gave up at that exact moment, a psychological profile that fits someone trapped in a hopeless situation, but also fits someone who was silencing a witness. The psychological profile of the girls, particularly Chris, was also examined. Friends describe Chris as being prone to anxiety and possibly struggling with the transition to life in Panama, leading to speculation that she might have experienced a mental breakdown on the trail, causing them to wander off the path. Lizanne, being the more responsible friend, might have stayed with her out of loyalty, resulting in both of them becoming lost. This theory attempts to explain the erratic behavior and the night photos, perhaps interpreting them as a delirious attempt to document their plight or a signal to the outside world. However, this does not explain the condition of the remains or the placement of the backpack, which required a level of cognitive function and physical effort that contradicts the image of 2 girls incapacitated by panic or starvation in a ravine. Years later, the case remains open in the minds of the public, a cold case that continues to generate documentaries, forums, and independent investigations. The dense jungle of Panama, with its hidden ravines and unpredictable rivers, holds the truth about what happened to Chris Kremers and Lizanne Frun. Were they victims of a tragic accident that spiraled into a survival nightmare, a simple mistake in navigation that cost them their lives in a hostile environment? Or did they meet a darker fate at the hands of another? Were the evidence staged to look like an accident? The digital footprints they left in the form of desperate phone calls and eerie flash photographs are a testament to their struggle, a final record of 2 young lives cut short in a beautiful but unforgiving wilderness. The lack of closure for their families is a painful reminder of the gaps in our understanding, a mystery that sits at the intersection of tragedy and suspicion, unlikely to ever be fully resolved. Number 5. The murder of Julia Wallace. On the rainy, windswept night of January 20th, 1931, the quiet, unassuming streets of Anfield, Liverpool, became the stage for a crime so complex and bewildering that it would challenge the finest legal minds in Britain and inspire generations of true crime enthusiasts and fiction writers alike. At the center of this labyrinthine mystery was William Herbert Wallace, a 52-year-old insurance collector for Prudential Assurance Company, a man described by those who knew him as a quiet, mild-mannered, and somewhat introverted individual who lived a regimented life, centered around his work and his passion for chess. He resided with his wife, Julia, at 29 Wolverton Street, a brick terrace house in a working-class district, leading an existence that was entirely ordinary until the ringing of a telephone at the city cafe on the evening of January 19 set in motion a sequence of events that would end in brutal violence and a controversial trial that captivated the nation. The case of Julia Wallace is often cited as the greatest unsolved murder in British history, not merely because the perpetrator vanished into the Liverpool fog, but because the evidence pointed with equal persuasive power in two diametrically opposite directions, toward a husband who claimed to be an innocent victim of a diabolical plot, and toward an unknown, shadowy figure who seemed to know the inner workings of the Wallace household. The genesis of the tragedy occurred on Monday evening, January 19th, when Wallace went to the City Cafe in Liverpool City Centre to play his regular game of chess. During the match, the cafe proprietor received a telephone call for Wallace. The caller, a man whose voice was unfamiliar, did not give his name but asked to speak to Wallace. When Wallace came to the phone, the mystery caller inquired about Wallace's insurance business, but then abruptly changed course, stating that he represented a client named Mr. R. M. Qualtrough who wished to discuss an insurance policy. The caller asked Wallace if he would be available to visit Mr. Qualtrough at his home at 25 Menlove Gardens East the following evening, Tuesday, January 20th at 7:30 p.m. Wallace, ever the diligent employee, agreed to the appointment, noting the address and the unusual spelling of the street name, Qualtrough. It was a peculiar request, made all the more strange by the late hour and the specific, somewhat distant location of Menlove Gardens, an affluent area in South Liverpool that required a significant journey across the city from the Wallace home in Anfield. Wallace returned to his game, seemingly unperturbed, though he did mention the call to his chess opponent, telling him about the prospective client and the address he was to visit the next night. The following day, William Wallace went about his rounds as an insurance collector, a routine that took him through the streets of Liverpool. He visited various clients to collect premiums, a task that required him to carry a cash box, though on this particular day, his takings were meager. The weather was miserable, with persistent rain, and a cold wind sweeping through the city, a gloomy backdrop to the events unfolding. Wallace arrived home at approximately 6 p.m. He spoke briefly with his neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Johnston, with whom he shared the entryway of the terrace house, and then went inside to have dinner with his wife, Julia. It was noted by the prosecution later that the conversation between Wallace and his wife that evening was mundane, touching on his day and the various household matters. At around 6:45 p.m., Wallace prepared to leave for his appointment at Menlove Gardens East. He asked his wife if she would like to come along, but she declined, preferring to stay home and keep warm by the fire. Wallace then donned his raincoat, picked up his trilby hat and his walking stick, and headed out into the wet night to catch a tram that would take him south toward the address he had been given. This was the beginning of the alibi that would eventually save Wallace's life, but which also painted him as a cold and calculated monster in the eyes of the police. Wallace claimed that he left the house at roughly 6:50 p.m. and caught a tram. He changed trams in the city center, a process that took time, and eventually arrived at the Menlove Gardens area around 7:15 p.m. He had intended to arrive a few minutes early, but the location was unfamiliar to him. Menlove Gardens was a large, square-shaped development with roads radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. When Wallace arrived, he began his search for number 25, walking along Menlove Gardens East. He stopped at a dairy shop to ask for directions, but the proprietor told him there was no number 25 on that road, nor on the adjacent Menlove Gardens west or south. The numbering in the square was erratic and confusing, with some numbers missing altogether. Wallace spent the next 45 minutes walking around the square, knocking on doors and searching in the rain for a house that did not exist. He asked a local constable for directions, but the officer was equally baffled by the address. Frustrated and realizing he had been sent on a fool's errand, Wallace eventually gave up and returned home, arriving back at 29 Wolverton Street sometime around 8:45 p.m. When Wallace returned to his door, he found it locked. This was not unusual, as Julia would often lock the door from the inside for security. He used his key to unlock the door, but found that the bolt was also fastened, meaning the door could not be opened with key alone. He knocked gently, receiving no answer. He then went around the back of the house, entering through the backyard, which was accessible via a passageway. He found the back door unlocked. As he entered the kitchen, the atmosphere felt wrong to him. The house was quiet, and the gas light in the front parlor was turned down low. He made his way to the front parlor, and there, on the hearth rug just in front of the gas fireplace, he discovered the body of his wife, Julia. She was lying on her back, her head battered and bleeding profusely. The scene was one of horrific violence, yet strangely contained. Wallace did not touch the body, but ran to the door and called for his neighbor, John Johnston, shouting that something terrible had happened to his wife. The police and a doctor were summoned, but it was immediately clear that Julia Wallace was dead. She had been struck repeatedly on the head with a blunt instrument, with at least 11 distinct wounds, crushing her skull. The investigation into the murder was led by Detective Superintendent Hubert Moore, a seasoned officer who quickly became suspicious of William Wallace's demeanor and his narrative. The crime scene presented a series of baffling contradictions. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. The front door had been bolted from the inside, and the back door, while unlocked, showed no signs of being forced. A mackintosh, or raincoat, belonging to Julia was found in the hallway, saturated with blood, placed beneath her body in a way that suggested it might have been used to soak up the blood, or perhaps wrapped around her during the attack. The murder weapon was missing, though it was presumed to be an iron bar or a similar heavy object, possibly one of the tools from the husband's collection. Crucially, Wallace's cash box, which contained the insurance premiums he had collected that day, was found in the kitchen. It had been emptied of its contents, approximately 4 pounds, and was lying open on the floor. This suggested a robbery motive. Yet the killer had ignored the much larger sum of cash hidden elsewhere in the house, a fact that Wallace was aware of, but the intruder presumably would not have been. As the police delved into Wallace's life, they uncovered a man who was intensely private and perhaps emotionally detached from his wife. Julia was 10 years older than William, and their marriage had been childless. There were whispers that Wallace had been involved with another woman, though no concrete evidence of infidelity was ever produced. Wallace's calmness in the face of his wife's gruesome death was interpreted by the police as a sign of psychopathy rather than shock. He did not weep or display the overt grief that was expected of a grieving husband. Furthermore, his explanation of the telephone call and the wild goose chase to Menlove Gardens seemed incredibly convenient. The police theory was that Wallace had manufactured the entire story of the Qualtrough call to establish an alibi for himself, creating a false appointment that would take him out of the house during the time the murder was committed. The fact that Menlove Gardens East did not have a number 25 was seen not as a mistake by a mysterious caller, but as a deliberate safeguard by Wallace to ensure he would be seen wandering around the area, asking for directions, thereby creating witnesses to his search for a non-existent house. The police investigation, however, hit a significant roadblock when the cafe staff confirmed that the telephone call had indeed been made, and that Wallace had taken it. This meant that unless Wallace had hired an accomplice to make the call, a theory that was considered but never proven, he could not have faked the origin of the appointment. Despite this, the Liverpool police became convinced of Wallace's guilt. They believed that he had left the house, murdered his wife, and then hurriedly caught a tram to the Menlove Gardens area, acting out the role of a confused man looking for an address to establish his alibi, relying on the time it took to travel there and back to create a window where the murder could have occurred. They theorized that the cash box robbery was staged to mask the true motive, which they suspected might be related to an affair or simply a desire to be free from a marriage. The forensic evidence, or lack thereof, was twisted to fit this narrative. The blood on Julia's mackintosh and the position of the body were analyzed to suggest a struggle that Wallace had committed before leaving the house. William Wallace was eventually charged with the murder of his wife and stood trial at the Liverpool Assizes in April 1931. The trial was a media sensation, drawing crowds to the court and dominating the headlines. The prosecution, led by Mr. H.G. Morton, painted Wallace as a cold, calculating killer who had meticulously planned the perfect murder, using his intelligence and methodical nature to outsmart the police. They highlighted the lack of a Qualtrough and the impossibility of the murder occurring during the brief window Wallace was away if he were innocent, arguing that the timeline required him to be the killer. They brought in witnesses to testify about Wallace's character, his lack of affection for his wife, and his peculiar behavior. The defense, led by the formidable Mr. Roland Oliver, countered with a robust argument that simply ignored the possibility of an intruder. They argued that the call to the cafe was real, that the address was a trap set for Wallace, and that while he was wandering around Menlove Gardens, an unknown person, a par unknown, as the French say, had entered the house, killed Julia, stolen the money, and fled. The defense pointed out that for Wallace to have committed the crime, he would have had to murder his wife, clean himself up, catch a tram, and convincingly act the part of the lost man, all within a time frame that was incredibly tight and fraught with the risk of being seen by someone who knew him. The case hinged on the timeline and the logistics of travel. The prosecution relied on tram schedules and witness testimonies to prove Wallace could have done it, while the defense argued that it was physically impossible. The jury, after deliberating for just over an hour, returned a verdict of not guilty. William Wallace was acquitted, largely due to lack of concrete physical evidence linking him to the murder weapon and the lingering doubt about the existence of the mysterious telephone caller. The public sentiment had also shifted in his favor during the trial, viewing him as a victim of a police force desperate to close a high-profile case. However, the acquittal did not restore Wallace's life to him. He was ostracized by the community, shunned as a man who got away with murder. His health deteriorated rapidly, and he died of kidney failure in 1933, just 2 years after the trial, taking the truth to his grave. Over the decades, the Wallace case has been re-examined by countless criminologists, detectives, and writers, including the famous mystery author Raymond Chandler, who was fascinated by the complexity of the puzzle. One of the most compelling alternative theories suggests that the killer was a young man who lived in the area and had a grudge against Wallace or a criminal intent. A man named Richard Perry, a former colleague of Wallace's at the Prudential Assurance Company, was suspected by some investigators. Perry was known to be a liar and a thief who had been fired for misconduct. He lived near the city cafe and was familiar with Wallace's routine. It has been theorized that Perry made the telephone call to lure Wallace out of the house, intending to burgle property, knowing Wallace would be away. When Julia confronted him, or if he was surprised to find her there, he killed her in a panic. This theory explains the telephone call, the lack of forced entry if Julia led him in thinking he was William, and the theft of the cash box. However, Perry had a strong alibi for the night of the murder, and he consistently denied any involvement until his death in the 1960s. Another theory posits that the crime was a result of a botched burglary by a local criminal who knew the Wallaces had cash in the house due to William's insurance rounds. The address at Menlove Gardens was simply a ruse to get William out of the way. The specificity of the address, even if it was a non-existent number, suggests someone who knew the area well enough to know it was a confusing dead end. The fact that the killer left behind a Macintosh and a weapon and seemingly panicked during the act points to an amateur criminal rather than a cold-blooded husband. The presence of the Macintosh, saturated with blood, has been interpreted by some as a clue that the killer tried to move the body or wipe up the mess, suggesting a disorganized crime scene rather than the staged perfection attributed to Wallace. Furthermore, the discovery of a rusty iron bar in a nearby yard some time after the murder, which was suspected to be the weapon, was never conclusively linked to the crime, but remained a point of interest for those seeking an external culprit. The enduring mystery of the Wallace case lies in the perfect balance of probability. It is entirely plausible that William Wallace, a man seemingly trapped in a loveless marriage and possessing the intelligence to devise a complex alibi, murdered his wife and staged a scene. The financial struggles of the marriage and his lack of emotional response provide a psychological motive. Conversely, it is equally plausible that he was an innocent man, the victim of a cruel hoax by a third party who intended to rob the house, but ended up committing a savage murder. The telephone call is the pivot point of the entire case. If Wallace did not make it, he cannot be the killer. If he did make it via an accomplice, he is the only logical suspect. Despite modern forensic techniques and reevaluations, no new evidence has emerged to definitively tip the scales. The bloodstains on the carpet, the locked door, and the phantom address of 25 Menlove Gardens each remain as they were in 1931. Silent witnesses to a crime that defies solution. Julia Wallace's murder remains a haunting example of how a human being can vanish behind a veil of circumstance, leaving behind a puzzle that justice has never been able to solve. Number 6. The Beaumont Children Disappearance. On a scorching hot Australia day, January 26, 1966, the bright, sun-drenched city of Adelaide, South Australia, was bustling with beachgoers celebrating the national holiday. But for the Beaumont family, the day would mark the beginning of a tragedy that would freeze the nation in horror and fundamentally change the way parents viewed their children's safety forever. Jim and Nancy Beaumont, a young couple living in the suburb of Somerton Park, had given their 3 children, 9-year-old Jane Beaumont, her 7-year-old sister Arna, and their 4-year-old brother Grant, permission to take the short bus ride from their home to the popular Glenelg Beach, a journey of less than 5 kilometers that they had made previously and considered safe in the quiet, trusting era of the 1960s. The children were excited to spend the day at the seaside, and Nancy gave them exactly 1 shilling and 6 pence for their bus fare and lunch, along with strict instructions to be home by a specific time. They left the house shortly after 10 a.m., dressed in their summer best. Jane in a white dress, Arna in a blue swimsuit with a matching top, and Grant in a pair of blue swimming trunks, and waved goodbye to their mother, a mundane gesture that would be the last time she would ever see them alive, transforming an ordinary day of childhood play into Australia's most enduring and heartbreaking cold case. The day progressed normally for the Beaumont parents until the children failed to return home by the agreed-upon time. As the hours ticked by and the afternoon turned into evening, worry began to set in. Jim Beaumont returned home from work to find his wife in a state of panic. And when the clock struck 7:30 p.m. with no sign of Jane, Arna, or Grant, he drove to the Glenelg bus station to meet the bus that should have brought them home. When the bus arrived and the doors opened, the driver confirmed that the children had indeed caught the bus to Glenelg that morning. But they were not on a return trip. Panic turned to dread as Jim searched the streets of Glenelg, checking the beach, the foreshore, and the amusement park, calling out their names into the gathering darkness, but receiving no response. By 9 p.m., the Beaumonts contacted police, triggering a search operation that would grow into the largest manhunt in Australian history. Thousands of volunteers, police officers, and military personnel combed the sand dunes, the water, and the surrounding suburbs, but despite the exhaustive efforts, not a single trace of the children, no clothing, no shoes, no bodies, was ever found. In the initial hours and days following the disappearance, witness accounts began to paint a disturbing picture of the children's movements, slowly revealing the chilling sequence of events that had led to their vanishing. The children were seen by multiple witnesses on the bus, behaving happily and chatting with other passengers, appearing entirely at ease. They arrived at Glenelg around 10:15 a.m. and were seen walking toward the beach, carrying their towels and bags. Throughout the morning, they were spotted playing near the jetty. At one point, a postmistress named Jean Ladder saw them buying a meat pie and pasty with the money their mother had given them, indicating they were following their normal routine. However, the timeline to the sinister turned around 11 a.m., when a witness reported seeing the 3 children walking away from the beach in the company of a tall, thin, blond man who appeared to be in his mid-30s. They were seen heading away from the ocean toward Collie Reserve, a grassy park area popular with picnickers, and the man was carrying the children's towels and possessions, suggesting the children trusted him implicitly. Further sightings corroborated this interaction. A shopkeeper reported seeing Jane Beaumont buying a cake and a soft drink with a £1 note, which was significantly more money than the shilling their mother had given them. This small detail became a crucial clue, implying that the children had met someone who had given them money, pointing to a prearranged meeting or a very persuasive stranger. The shopkeeper noted that Jane seemed to be buying the items for herself and the man she was with, deepening the mystery of his identity. Later that afternoon, around 3 p.m., the children were seen again by a local woman who knew them by sight. They were walking alone, heading back toward the beach, but the witness noted that they stopped and turned around, as if they were waiting for someone or had changed their minds. This was the last confirmed sighting of the Beaumont children alive. The contrast between the carefree morning and the ominous encounter with a tall stranger created a terrifying narrative of abduction that gripped the public consciousness. As the investigation deepened, the police focused heavily on the description of the man seen with the children. He was described as being athletic, tan, and blonde, wearing swim trunks and appearing relaxed. In the subsequent weeks, the police received hundreds of tips from members of the public who claimed to have seen a man matching this description in the area. One of the most promising leads came from a woman who had been at the Collie Reserve on the day of the disappearance. She reported seeing a man playing with 3 children on the grass and she later claimed to have seen him again, looking anxious and watching the clock, pacing near the bus stop. She described him as having a distinctive, lantern jaw and a high-pitched voice. This composite sketch, based on her memory and others, became the iconic image of the suspect, circulated widely in newspapers and on television. Yet despite the publicity, the man was never identified. The theory that the children knew their abductor, or had been groomed by him in the days leading up to the disappearance, gained traction, as the children were known to be shy and unlikely to wander off a complete stranger without a struggle. The investigation was plagued by false leads and hoaxes that tormented the Beaumont parents and exhausted police resources. One of the most cruel incidents involved a letter sent to the parents claiming to be from their daughter Jane, stating that they were being well cared for and were in a place called Dandenong. Another letter arrived, allegedly from a man who had the children, and demanded a ransom. These were eventually proven to be hoaxes, likely written by malicious individuals seeking attention or profit from the family's misery. There was also a reported sighting of the children at a fruit shop in the nearby town of Prospect, several days after they vanished, but this could not be verified. The police were under immense pressure to solve the case, and a lack of physical evidence. No bodies, no crime scene, no ransom demands, left them working in a vacuum, chasing shadows and fragmented testimony that never quite formed a coherent picture. For Jim and Nancy Beaumont, the ordeal was a living nightmare. They held on to the hope that their children had been kidnapped and would eventually be returned, keeping the house exactly as the children had left it, preserving their toys and clothes in anticipation of their return. They waited by the phone for years, refusing to move or change their lifestyle, terrified that if the children did come home, they would not find their parents waiting for them. The couple eventually sold the house in the 1970s and moved away, but their marriage eventually collapsed under the immense strain and grief, a common tragedy for parents of missing children who never find closure. The disappearance of the Beaumont children also shattered the innocence of Australian society. In the 1960s, it was common for children to play outside unsupervised, to roam the neighborhood, and to travel alone on public transport. The abduction changed the cultural landscape, introducing a new era of anxiety regarding stranger danger and leading parents to keep a much closer watch on their children, a societal shift that remains in place today. Over the decades, the case has been linked to several other suspects in crimes, most notably the Adelaide Oval abductions and the murder of the Collinsville baby, keeping the theory of a serial killer operating in Adelaide at the forefront of speculation. The prime suspect for many years was a man named Bevan Spencer Von Einem, a notorious convicted murderer who was jailed in 1983 for the murder of a young teenager. Von Einem was known to have associated with a pedophile ring in Adelaide during the 1960s and 70s, and his physical profile in his younger years bore resemblance to the composite sketch of the man seen at Glenoak. In the 1980s, two men came forward claiming that Von Einem had confessed to killing the Beaumont children, describing how he had taken them to his house and experimented on them, leading to their accidental deaths. He allegedly claimed to have buried their bodies in a concrete structure at a construction site or hidden them in the walls of a building. However, Von Einem never confessed to the crimes officially, and despite intense police scrutiny, no physical evidence was ever found to link him to the Beaumont children. The search for the children's remains has continued sporadically over the last half-century. In 2013, a significant excavation took place at a factory site in North Adelaide, following a tip-off from two men who claimed they had helped bury the bodies there in 1966. The lead was considered credible enough to warrant a major operation involving forensic archaeologists and heavy machinery, tearing up concrete floors and digging deep into the earth. The Beaumont parents, now elderly or deceased, were updated on the progress, hoping for a resolution. However, after weeks of digging, the police found no human remains and no evidence linking the site to the children, dealing another crushing blow to the prospect of closure. Other sites, including a zoo and a cast concrete structure at a building site, have been investigated over the years, but all have yielded nothing. The fact that 3 bodies could be so effectively hidden in an urban area is one of the most baffling aspects of the case. The psychological profile of the abductor has been debated by profilers and criminologists for decades. The fact that he took 3 children, 2 of whom were older and capable of running away or screaming, suggests a person who was either highly authoritative and intimidating, or someone who had successfully gained their trust beforehand. The use of money to buy the cake and the relaxed demeanor of the children seen walking with a man points to a grooming process. It is possible the man had befriended the family or met the children on a previous visit to the beach, establishing a rapport that made them feel safe with him. The abduction was quick, clean, and executed without leaving a mess or a witness, indicating a level of planning and composure that is terrifying. The suspect was likely a local, familiar with the layout of Glenelg and the bus schedules, and he had a vehicle or a hiding place nearby to move the children quickly away from the area. The legacy of the Beaumont children is a somber one. Jane, Arna, and Gran have become symbols of lost innocence, their faces frozen in time in the black and white photographs distributed in 1966. The case remains open with the South Australia Police, and it is periodically reviewed whenever new technology or new information comes to light. In 2018, a $1 million reward was offered for information leading to the recovery of the children's remains or the apprehension of their killer, the largest reward in South Australian history for a missing persons case. This reward generated a fresh wave of tips, but as of yet, none have provided the definitive breakthrough needed to solve the mystery. The disappearance of the Beaumont children is a wound that is never healed for Australia. It is a story that every Australian knows, a cautionary tale told from one generation to the next, a reminder of the evil that can lurk beneath the surface of a sunny summer day. Until their remains are found and the perpetrator is named, the spirit of those 3 children haunts the sands of Glenelg, a silent plea for justice that echoes through the decades. Number 7, the Sodder children disappearance. On a snowy, cold Christmas Eve in 1945, the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, was a tableau of festive anticipation. But for the Sodder family, the holiday season would dissolve into a nightmare of fire and mystery that would span decades and defy all rational explanation. George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants who had built a successful life and a large 2-story frame home on Route 16, were raising 9 children, 5 boys and 4 girls. The house was bustling with activity that evening. The older children had gone to bed, but the youngest, Sylvia, who was only 2, was sleeping in the upstairs bedroom with her mother, while George and the 2 eldest boys, John and George Jr., had retired to the first-floor bedroom after a long day of work. Marion, the eldest daughter, was in her own room on the ground floor, and the remaining 5 children, Maurice 14, Martha 12, Louis 9, Jenny 8, and Betty 5, were reportedly allowed to stay up late to play with their new toys, a rare treat that would later become a haunting detail in the family's tragedy. At approximately 12:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, the peace of the night was shattered when the phone rang in the house. Jenny Sodder woke to answer it, but heard only silence on the other end, perhaps a wrong number or a prank. Yet as she returned to bed, she noticed that the lights in the house were still on, which was unusual as the children often forgot to turn them off. Marion, who had fallen asleep on the living room couch, was awakened by the sound of a loud banging on the roof, sound like a ball or a heavy object rolling, followed by the distinct noise of something hitting the house with force. She thought it was just the frost falling or the wind, but these disturbances were the first harbingers of the disaster come. Less than an hour later, around 1 a.m., the eldest son, John Sodder, was awakened from his sleep in the basement bedroom by the smell of smoke. Rushing upstairs, he discovered a fire emanating from the office room situated between the garage and the main house, a space that housed George's coal business telephone and a fuse box. The flames were already raging, consuming the wooden structure with terrifying speed. John screamed for his brothers and parents, waking the household in a panic. George Sodder rushed to the upstairs bedroom to grab his wife and baby, Sylvia, while John and his brother George Jr. attempted to go back into the house to rescue the 5 younger children who were sleeping in the bedrooms on the second floor. The heat and the smoke were overwhelming, and the stairway was already engulfed in flames, making it impossible to descend. In desperation, they tried to climb the outside wall to reach the windows, but the flames repelled them. George, in a frantic attempt to get to his children, ran to his coal trucks parked outside, intending to use them to climb onto the roof. But the trucks, which he used every day and had left parked just hours earlier, refused to start. It was a frustrating and inexplicable mechanical failure that would haunt him for the rest of his life. With the fire department unable to respond promptly, the chief was also a volunteer and the family had to rely on a neighbor driving to town to sound the alarm. The house was quickly reduced to a smoldering ruin. As the sun rose on Christmas morning, the Sodder family stood in the snow, looking at the ashes of their home, expecting the worst but praying for a miracle. They believed that the 5 children trapped inside, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, had perished in the inferno. The fire department, though they had arrived late, had doused the embers, and the local authorities began to sift through the debris. However, no human remains were found. In a typical house fire of that magnitude, especially one involving wooden construction and trapped victims, bones and teeth are almost always found, as they are resistant to even the highest temperatures. The fire chief told George Sodder that the intense heat of the blaze had likely vaporized the bodies completely, turning the bones to ash. This explanation, while technically possible in a crematorium with sustained high temperatures, is scientifically inconsistent with a house fire, which usually burns at fluctuating temperatures and leaves skeletal fragments. This lack of physical evidence was the first crack in the official narrative, a seed of doubt that would grow into an obsession for George and Jenny Sodder. In the days following the fire, as the family tried to come to terms with their loss, strange and disturbing reports began to surface that contradicted the theory that the children had died in their beds. A woman who had been driving near the house on the night of the fire claimed she had seen people throwing fireballs at the structure, suggesting arson rather than an accident. Another witness reported seeing the 5 children watching the fire from a passing car as they drove down the road, looking terrified. A operator at a local hotel in nearby Montgomery, about 50 miles away, claimed to have served breakfast to 5 children, who matched the Sodder kids' descriptions the morning after the fire, accompanied by adults who seemed to be holding them against their will. These sightings, though fragmented and anecdotal, ignited a spark of hope in the grieving parents that perhaps their children had been kidnapped before the fire started, or had escaped the blaze only to be taken by whoever had set it. George Sodder, unable to accept the verdict of accidental death without bodies, launched his own investigation. He began to uncover anomalies that suggested a sinister plot. He discovered that the family's phone line had been cut, explaining the strange call Jenny received and why they couldn't call for help quickly. He also found that the ladder, which was usually propped against the house, had been moved and hidden in the weeds, preventing the children from escaping through the upstairs windows. Most disturbingly, a man who had been working on the electrical lines near the house months earlier had warned George that his fuse box would catch fire one day and burn down the house, a chillingly prophetic statement that took on a sinister tone in retrospect. George also learned that a local insurance salesman had visited the house shortly before the fire and tried to sell George more insurance, becoming angry and hostile when George declined, shouting that his damn house was going to burn down and his children were going to be destroyed. These pieces of the puzzle pointed toward a motive of revenge or intimidation rather than a tragic accident. For years after the fire, in 1949, George Sodder received a letter in the mail with no return address, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his early 20s, with features that looked strikingly similar to Louis Sodder, who would have been 9 years old at the time of the fire. On the back of the photo, a handwritten note read, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Illo boys, A90132 or 35. The Sodders were convinced this was their son, aged up, and the code on the back might have referred to a location or a file number. They hired a private detective to go to Central City to find the sender, but the detective vanished without a trace, never reporting back, leaving the family with a photo that promised everything but led nowhere. This photo became a talisman for the family, a symbol of their belief that the children were alive somewhere, perhaps held captive or living under new identities, and it spurred them to continue their search when others urged them to let go. The Sodder family turned their property into a giant billboard, erecting a massive sign along the busy Route 16 highway offering a reward for information leading to the recovery of the children. The sign, which stood for decades, displayed the faces of the missing children and the reward money, which eventually grew to $10,000, a fortune in the post-war economy. They traveled extensively, following leads across the United States, chasing down rumors of children who looked like theirs, investigating every tip, no matter how slim. George even went so far as to contact the FBI, but the local authorities dissuaded the federal agency from getting involved, insisted it was a local matter and that the fire was an accident. The official stance of the fire department and the local coroner was that the children had died and the case was closed. This resistance from the authorities only deepened the Sodder suspicion that there was a cover-up, possibly involving the mafia or anti-Italian sentiment that was prevalent in the area at the time, given George's vocal criticism of the Mussolini regime during World War II. The physical evidence continued to puzzle experts. Excavations of the basement where the fire allegedly started yielded no human remains, but they did find small bone fragments. The Sodders had these fragments analyzed by a pathologist in Washington, D.C., who determined that they were human vertebrae, but that they showed no signs of having been exposed to fire. This meant the bones were old and had been buried there long before the house was built, or they had been planted. The official fire marshal, however, insisted they were from the children, despite the lack of burn marks. The discrepancy between the scientific findings and the official narrative fueled conspiracy theories. The Sodders began to believe that the fire was a diversion to abduct the children, perhaps to prevent George from continuing his political activism, or as retaliation for his business success in a community that was sometimes hostile to immigrants. They theorized that the abductors had entered the house, taken the children, and then set the fire to cover their tracks and eliminate witnesses. The psychological toll on the surviving family members was immense. Jenny Sodder kept the children's room exactly as it was on the night of the fire, waiting for them to return, a shrine to a lost future. The surviving children grew up in the shadow of the tragedy, their lives defined by the search for their siblings. George Sodder became a man consumed, driving the highways, stopping at diners and gas stations, showing a photo of Lewis to anyone who would listen. He died in 1969, still believing his children were out there, his last wish being to know what happened to them. Jenny Sodder never left the house, wearing black and maintaining the vigil until her death in 1989. Their dedication transformed the Sodder case from a local tragedy into a legendary American mystery, a story of parental love versus a cruel and inexplicable fate. In the late 20th century, a new theory emerged regarding the remains. In 1968, a fire in a home near Charleston, West Virginia, resulted in the discovery of remains, but the link to the Sodders was tenuous. However, it was the re-examination of the bone fragments found in 1949 that provided a glimmer of scientific clarity. Modern forensic analysis suggested that the vertebrae did not belong to children, but to an adult, casting further doubt on the official story that the children had burned up in the house. If no children died in the house, where did they go? The theory that they were kidnapped by a child trafficking ring or a group seeking revenge gained traction, though no specific group was ever identified. The Sicilian Mafia, or the Black Hand, was a popular suspect in the public imagination due to George's heritage and his political stances, but no concrete evidence ever linked organized crime to the arson and abduction. The mystery of the Sodder children remains unsolved, a void in the history of Fayetteville that has never been filled. The house is gone, the billboard has been taken down, and the surviving siblings have passed away. But the questions linger. How could 5 children vanish in the middle of the night without a trace? Was the fire a tragic accident that claimed their lives, destroying their bodies so completely that nothing remained, or was it a brilliantly executed criminal plot to steal them away? The lack of bodies is the screaming silence at the heart of this case. In the absence of definitive proof, the Sodder family's version of events, that their children were taken from them, feels more plausible than the scientific impossibility of total cremation in a house fire. The story of the Sodder children is a testament to the enduring power of hope and the refusal of parents to accept a reality that makes no sense. It stands as a warning that sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and that in the dark shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, secrets can be buried forever. Number 8. The Hinterkaifeck murders. Deep within the dense, snow-covered forests of Bavaria, Germany, approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich, lies the secluded farmstead of Hinterkaifeck, a name that will forever be etched in criminal history as the site of one of the most bizarre and gruesome unsolved massacres the world has ever known. In the years leading up to 1922, the farm was inhabited by the Gruber family. 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, a widower known for his grim demeanor and apparent unpopularity in the local community, his 41-year-old daughter Kazilia, who was separated from her husband, her 2 children, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph, and the 44-year-old maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived at the farm only hours before the tragedy. The family lived a life of relative isolation, tending to their livestock and crops. But in the months preceding the murders, a palpable sense of dread had begun to settle over the household. Andreas Gruber had confided in neighbors and friends that he believed the farm was being haunted or stalked. He told them about footsteps in the snow that led from the woods toward the farm, but never back, indicating that someone had approached the house with no intention of leaving. He discovered strange footprints in the attic and found a newspaper from Munich on the farm that no one in the family had bought or read. Most disturbingly, he mentioned that a set of house keys had gone missing from the kitchen, a detail that suggested an intruder might already have access to the locked rooms of the house. Despite these terrifying premonitions, Andreas Gruber never notified the police, a decision that would ultimately prove fatal for everyone living under his roof. The horrific discovery was made on April 4th, 1922, by neighbors who had grown concerned after noticing that none of the Gruber family had been seen for several days, and that the postman had accumulated a pile of uncollected mail. The neighbors, Albert Hoffner and his two sons, traveled to the farm to investigate and were met with an eerie silence. Upon entering the barn, they made a gruesome discovery. The bodies of Andreas Gruber, his daughter Kazilia, and 7-year-old Kazilia were lying huddled together on the straw, brutally bludgeoned to death with a mattock, a pick-like farming tool. The elder Kazilia lay next to her father, her hands tangled in her hair, while the young Kazilia was found with a gash on her face, evidence of a violent struggle. The scene suggested that the attackers had lured the family into the barn one by one, or had ambushed them as they went about their evening chores. Panicked and horrified, the neighbors rushed to the main farmhouse to check on the others. Inside, they found the body of 2-year-old Joseph in his crib in his mother's bedroom. He had been killed in the same manner, bludgeoned with the mattock while he slept. In the servants' quarters, they found the newly arrived maid, Maria Baumgartner, dead on the floor, having suffered the same brutal fate. The lack of any signs of struggle inside the house suggested that the attack had been swift and overwhelming, catching the victims entirely off guard. The sheer brutality of the crime was shocking, but the circumstances surrounding the events at Hinterkaifeck in the days and weeks following the murders were even more perplexing. It became evident that the killer had not only murdered the family, but had subsequently lived in the farmhouse for several days after crime. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney days after the family was believed to have died. The livestock had been fed, the barn had been cleaned, and meals had been prepared in the kitchen, indicating that the perpetrator had made himself at home in the midst of the carnage. Breadcrumbs were found on the kitchen table, and someone had consumed the food supplies in the pantry. The killer or killers had slept in the beds and had even cut the family's hair, although the reason for this bizarre act remains a subject of speculation. This post-crime behavior suggests a level of psychopathy and comfort with the environment that is chilling, implying that the murderer was someone who knew the layout of the house and felt a perverse sense of ownership over the farm, or perhaps a vagrant who had been living in the attic or the outbuildings for some time, which would explain the footprints Andreas Gruber had seen earlier. The investigation was led by the police from a nearby town of Schrobenhausen, but it was marred by incompetence and bad luck from the very beginning. In the chaotic rush to examine the crime scene, a large number of people, including neighbors, police officers, and curious onlookers, trampled through the snow and mud, destroying any potential footprints or tire tracks that might have led to the killer. The crime scene was compromised to such an extent that modern forensic experts have often cited it as a textbook example of how not to handle an investigation. Despite the lack of physical trace evidence, the police did conduct numerous interviews and interrogations, eventually settling on a few prime suspects. The primary motive was initially thought to be robbery, as a large sum of money was known to be kept in the house. However, the killer had left a significant amount of cash behind, only taking a smaller portion, which shifted the suspicion toward a crime of passion, or revenge rather than simple greed. The list of suspects was long and varied, rooted in the complex and often sordid social web of the small Bavarian farming community. Andreas Gruber was not a well-liked man. He had a reputation for being harsh and abusive, and there were rumors of an incestuous relationship with his daughter, Kazilia, which had resulted in the birth of little Joseph. This dark secret, if true, would have been a powerful motive for murder, perhaps to eliminate the shame or to silence the rumors. One of the early suspects was Carl Gabriel, the husband of the elder Kazilia. He had been reported killed in action during World War I several years prior, but his body was never found. Rumors swirled that Carl had not died in France, but had returned to the area under a false identity, possibly that of a vagrant or a traveling laborer, to exact revenge on his wife and her father for the alleged incest and the illegitimate child. The theory that the killer was a stranger who had been living in the attic, supported by the footprints and the missing newspaper, lent some credence to the idea of a returning, embittered soldier, but no definitive link was ever established. Another strong suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor and father of the child with whom the younger Kazilia was alleged to have had a relationship. Schlittenbauer was one of the men who discovered the bodies and was seen entering the house and removing the body of the maid, claiming he wanted to check for signs of life. His behavior was erratic and aggressive during the investigation, and he was known to have had conflicts with Andreas Gruber over property boundaries and livestock. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Schlittenbauer near the farm on the day of the murders, and his knowledge of the layout of the house and the family's routine made him a viable suspect. Furthermore, the young Kazilia had been seen with a bruise on her face shortly before the murders, leading to speculation that Schlittenbauer had been abusing her, a secret that the family might have been threatening to expose. However, despite the circumstantial evidence and his strange demeanor, the police were unable to find any physical evidence linking him to the crime, such as blood on his clothing or the murder weapon. The murder weapon itself, a heavy mattock, was found near the bodies, but had been wiped clean of fingerprints, a detail that points to a premeditated act rather than a crime of sudden rage. The killer had brought the weapon with them or had selected it carefully, suggesting they knew where it was kept. The brutality of the attacks, particularly the number of blows inflicted on the victims, indicated a deep-seated rage or desire to ensure that no one survived. The fact that the 2-year-old Joseph was killed in his crib suggested a lack of empathy and a cold-blooded determination to eliminate the entire family line. The autopsy reports, which were rudimentary by today's standards, noted that the elder Kazilia had been alive for some time after the initial attack and had pulled out her own hair in agony, a gruesome detail that painted a picture of prolonged suffering. As the investigation stalled, the police turned their attention to the possibility of a group of perpetrators. The sheer difficulty of subduing 5 active individuals, including an adult male and a child who could run or fight, suggested that one person might have found it difficult to carry out the attack alone. However, the lack of eyewitnesses and the contaminated crime scene made it impossible to determine if there was a single attacker or an accomplice. The theory of a traveling serial killer or a band of robbers was considered, as there were other unsolved murders in the region during that period, but the unique nature of the Hinterkaifeck murders, specifically the prolonged stay at the farm afterward, set apart from typical criminal acts. The killer's comfort level in the house, feeding the animals and eating the food, suggested familiarity with rural life and a lack of fear of being discovered, hinting that the perpetrator might have been a local who knew the family's habits and the isolation of the farm. Decades passed, and the mystery of Hinterkaifeck faded into local legend, becoming a ghost story told in the region, but the case was never officially closed. In the 1950s and 70s, the police revisited the evidence and interviewed surviving witnesses, but no new breakthroughs emerged. The bodies were exhumed and re-examined, but the decomposition and the passage of time yielded no new forensic clues. In 2007, students from the police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck conducted a reenactment of the crime in an attempt to understand the timeline and the movement of the killer, but they only succeeded in confirming how difficult the case was to solve with the lost evidence. The Gruber house itself was demolished in 1923, just a year after the murders, as it stood empty and was considered too tainted by tragedy to be inhabited. The site remains a grassy clearing in the woods, marked only by a memorial shrine that attracts the occasional dark tourist or curious investigator. The psychological profile of the Hinterkaifeck killer is a subject of endless debate. Was it a calculating sociopath who stalked the family for weeks, deriving pleasure from their fear and the intrusion into their home? Or was it a vengeful family member or neighbor who snapped under the weight of secrets and grievances? The act of cutting the hair of the victims is particularly eerie and has been interpreted by some experts as a sign of humiliation or a ritualistic desire to possess a part of the victims. Others have suggested it might have been done to prevent identification, although the killer did not bother to hide the faces of the dead. The killer's ability to live in a house for days with the corpses of the people he murdered suggests a detachment from reality or a psychopathic need to dominate the space completely, turning the family home into his own macabre fortress. In the end, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain a terrifying enigma, a perfect storm of isolation, bad police work, and bizarre criminal behavior. The case continues to fascinate criminologists and the public because it violates our expectations of how a murder mystery should resolve. There is no clear who, no clear why, and no justice to the victims. The snow that fell on the farm in the spring of 1922 covered the tracks of the killer, and the silence of Bavarian forest has kept the secret ever since. The Gruber family lies buried in a cemetery in Schrobenhausen, their tombstone a quiet reminder of the violence that befell them, while the ghost of Hinterkaifeck continues to haunt the imagination of Germany, a dark fairy tale that is all too real, a reminder that evil can lurk in the quietest corners of the world, waiting behind the barn door, watching from the attic. Number 9. The Jamison family disappearance. On a crisp October day in 2009, the rugged, treacherous terrain of the Sambois Mountains in southeastern Oklahoma became the backdrop for one of the most confounding and tragic vanishing cases in American history. The Jamison family, Bobby Jamison, a 44-year-old man described as quiet and hardworking. His wife, Sherilyn Jamison, a 40-year-old woman known for her devotion to her family and her deep religious faith, and their 6-year-old daughter, Madison, set out to look for a plot of land to purchase. They were driving their metallic green pickup truck, pulling a white dual-axle trailer, a journey that they hoped would lead them to a new beginning away from the complexities of their current lives. Bobby and Sherilyn have been experiencing a period of significant stress. They were involved in a bitter lawsuit with Bobby's father over proceeds from the sale of the family business, and there were whispers of internal family turmoil and alleged threats that left the couple feeling paranoid and unsafe. Friends and family noted that the couple had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, claiming they were seeing spirits and that people were watching them, a behavior that would later fuel intense speculation about their mental state and the true nature of their trip into the mountains. The last confirmed sighting of the Jamison family occurred on October 8, 2009, as they were driving up the dirt road of Panola Mountain, a remote area known for its steep inclines and dense forests. A witness, a local hunter, recalled seeing the truck parked on the side of the road with the engine running. He observed the family sitting inside the vehicle, but the interaction was unsettling. They appeared to be staring blankly into space, seemingly transfixed by something on a hillside, though the hunter could see nothing there. He described them as looking catatonic, or zombie-like, a stark contrast to the vibrant family they were known to be. He waved at them, but they did not respond. This eerie image of the Jamison family frozen in time, staring into the void, will become a haunting symbol of the mystery. After this sighting, the family effectively vanished off the face of the earth. Their truck was found abandoned 4 days later, on October 12th, parked on a remote trail about 25 miles from their last known sighting. When authorities located the truck, they found a scene that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The vehicle was unlocked, and the engine was cold. Inside the cab, the family's loyal dog, a small Yorkshire Terrier named Maisie, was found alive, emaciated and dehydrated, but still guarding the vehicle. The presence of the dog was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Typically, if the family had walked away from the truck to seek help or to meet someone, they likely would have taken the dog with them or at least let out of the cab. The fact that Maisie was left inside suggested that whatever happened to the Jamisons happened suddenly and violently, or that they were incapacitated in a way that prevented them from caring for the animal. Inside the truck, police found the family's wallets, ID cards, Sherilyn's cell phone, a GPS device, and about $32,000 in cash. The large sum of money was particularly baffling. Why would a family carrying that amount of cash leave it behind in an unlocked vehicle? It effectively ruled out robbery as a primary motive, as no thief would leave thousands of dollars on the seat. The car keys were also missing, hinting that someone might have taken them to prevent the family from driving away, or perhaps the family had taken them with them into the wilderness. The contents of the truck provided a glimpse into the disturbed psyche of the parents, particularly Sherilyn. A police report listed a series of disturbing items found in the vehicle, including a wrapped gift, a purse, a wallet, and a letter on the dash. While the contents of the letter have never been publicly released in full, it was reportedly a will's letter or a suicide note of sorts, expressing feelings of despair and hopelessness. Additionally, a Bible was opened to a passage regarding the souls of the righteous and death. On the passenger side seat, investigators found a hand-drawn picture of what appeared to be a treasure map or a route, though its significance remained unclear. The combination of the cache, the ominous letter, the religious texts, and the family's prior reports of being watched led investigators down two divergent paths. Either the Jamison family had succumbed to a mental health crisis and wandered into the woods to die, or they had been targeted by a malevolent force that knew their vulnerabilities. The search for the Jamisons was massive, involving multiple agencies, volunteer search and rescue teams, and even the FBI, who used drones to scan the rugged landscape. Despite the exhaustive efforts, no trace of Bobby, Sherilyn, or Madison was found. The terrain around the Sambois Mountains is unforgiving, filled with deep ravines, thick brambles, and wild animals, including bears and coyotes. The theory that they had walked away from the truck and succumbed to the elements was a strong possibility, given the onset of winter and the family's lack of survival gear. They were dressed for a drive, not a hike, and the temperatures in the mountains at night could drop to freezing. However, the lack of any physical evidence, no clothing, no footprints, no remains, made this theory difficult to accept completely. If they had died of exposure, their bodies should have been found eventually. 4 years after their disappearance, in November 2013, a tragic breakthrough finally occurred. Two hunters stumbled upon human remains in a remote, heavily wooded area of Latimer County, about 3 miles from where the truck was abandoned. The skeletal remains were scattered and difficult to identify, but dental records and DNA testing eventually confirmed that they belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. The discovery brought a grim conclusion to the uncertainty, but raised even more questions than it answered. The cause of death could not be definitively determined due to the condition of the bones, but the manner of death was ruled a homicide. There was no evidence of trauma on the bones that could point to a weapon, but the location of the bodies and the fact that they were found together suggested they had been killed and deposited there or had died there and were never found. The small size of the skull found belonging to Madison confirmed the worst fears of the family, that the little girl had perished alongside her parents. The discovery of the bodies shifted the focus back to the possibility of foul play. The Jamison family had numerous enemies and complex relationships that provided a plethora of suspects. Bobby's father, Bob Jamison, had been involved in a bitter dispute with the couple over the ownership of the family oil tank cleaning business. There were reports of heated arguments and threats exchanged, giving the father a motive, though he was never charged and consistently denied any involvement. Another potential suspect was a man named Kenneth Pike, who lived in a camper near the property the Jamisons were interested in purchasing. Pike had a violent criminal history and had reportedly had a confrontation with Bobby Jamison on the mountain just days before the disappearance. He was arrested on unrelated charges shortly after the family vanished, but was eventually released and died of natural causes in 2014 before he could be conclusively linked to the murders. The web of suspects also extended to a private investigator the family had reportedly hired to look into the threats they were receiving, though his involvement remains murky and speculative. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case, and one that continues to defy explanation, is a series of photographs found on a camera inside the Jamisons' truck. Among the mundane photos of the landscape and the family, there were several images of Madison Jamison taken on the day they vanished. In most of the photos, she looks like a normal, happy child playing in the woods. However, one particular photo is deeply disturbing. In it, Madison is standing on a rocky outcrop, and her expression is one of sheer terror. Her eyes are wide, her mouth is open as if screaming, and her arms are slightly raised. Some analysts have suggested that she was reacting to seeing something behind the photographer, perhaps an intruder or an animal. Others believe the photo was taken in the middle of a fall or a tantrum. The context of the photo is lost to time, but for the family and the public, it captures a precise moment the Jamison family's happiness turned to horror. It is a frozen moment of fear that suggests their final moments were filled with panic. The mental health of Bobby and Sherilyn remains a central, albeit controversial, point of discussion. Friends and relatives reported that the couple believed their house was haunted and that they were being spied upon through the walls. They had reported seeing spirit orbs and had told a pastor that they felt evil was closing in on them. In the weeks before their disappearance, Sherilyn had written a cryptic message on her home computer. "The dead are walking around. I saw a ghost." This behavior has led some experts to theorize that the family was suffering from a shared psychotic disorder or that they were under the influence of drugs, possibly methamphetamine, which can induce paranoia and hallucinations. The theory is that they drove into the mountains to escape the demons they believed were chasing them, committed a murder-suicide pact, or simply wander off in a drug-induced delirium. However, the finding of their bodies and the ruling of homicide complicates this theory. If they had killed themselves, how did they manage to bury or hide themselves so effectively? If they died of exposure, why were there no signs of a camp or a struggle? The official investigation, led by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI, has been hampered by the lack of forensic evidence and a confusing array of clues that point in every direction. The OSBI has stated that they believe the family was murdered, but they have not named a suspect or a person of interest in years. The case file remains open, but active investigation has slowed to a crawl. The isolation of the crime scene, the passage of time, and the degradation of evidence have made it a nearly impossible case to solve. The family of the Jamisons, particularly Bobby's mother, has been relentless in keeping the case in the public eye, organizing searches, and maintaining a Facebook page dedicated to finding answers. They refuse to believe that Bobby and Sherilyn would have taken Madison into the woods to harm her, citing their love for their daughter as the central fact of their lives. The mystery of the Jamison family is a modern American tragedy that touches on themes of mental illness, familial conflict, and the dark allure of the wilderness. It is a story that resonates because it can happen to anyone. A family sets out for a drive and simply ceases to exist. The discovery of the bodies provided a measure of closure, but the how and why remain elusive. Was it a calculated hit by someone who knew their route? Was it a random encounter with a dangerous individual in the mountains? Or was it a tragic convergence of paranoia and fate that led a vulnerable family to their doom? The Sam Bois Mountains hold the secret, and they are not talking. The legacy of the Jamison family is a warning about the fragility of life and the thin veil that separates the mundane from the catastrophic. As the wind blows through the trees of Latimer County, it carries the whispers of the lost, a reminder that 3 souls are still waiting for justice. Number 10, The Severed Feet Mystery. Beginning in the summer of 2007, a macabre and entirely unprecedented phenomenon began to unfold along the rugged, rain-swept coastlines of the Salish Sea, a sprawling network of coastal waterways that separates southern Vancouver Island from the mainland of British Columbia, Canada, and reaches down into the northwestern United States. It started on August 20th, 2007, when a 12-year-old girl named Anastasia Nemchinov was visiting Jedediah Island, a remote and typically serene location in the Strait of Georgia. While walking along the beach, she stumbled upon a frightening object lodged in a piece of floating driftwood. A human foot, still encased in a size 12 men's running shoe. The discovery was shocking enough to warrant a call to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, who arrived to collect the remains. What made this find particularly disturbing was not just the presence of a severed limb on a public beach, but that the foot appeared to have been severed cleanly from the leg, not torn or chewed by marine life, and that the shoe, a black Campager sneaker, was still largely intact and recognizable. Within 6 days, another foot was found by a hiker on nearby Gabriel Island. This one also a right foot, also in a size 12 sneaker, but a different brand and style. This second foot was matched with the first, confirming that they belonged to the same individual, a man whose identity and the circumstances of his death were entirely unknown. Over the ensuing years, what began as a bizarre anomaly evolved into a persistent and chilling pattern. As of 2024, a total of 21 detached human feet have been discovered on the coast of the Salish Sea, primarily in the Gulf Islands and the Fraser River Delta near Vancouver, but also as far south as Washington State. The discoveries have captured the morbid curiosity of the world and fueled a frenzy of speculation, ranging from the plausible to the preposterous. The immediate question that haunted the public and law enforcement was how these feet, belonging to men, women, and even children, were washing ashore while the rest of the bodies remained stubbornly hidden beneath the waves. Theories abounded, Was this the work of a serial killer with bizarre maritime signature? Were these the victims of a human trafficking ring or a massive drug deal gone wrong? Did a plane crash in the Pacific Ocean go unnoticed, leaving only these floating appendages as evidence? Or, as the science eventually suggested, was this a grim combination of natural taphonomy, the unique environment of the Salish Sea, and the tragic ubiquity of suicide and accidental death? The scientific explanation, while less sensational than a murder mystery, provides a compelling rationale for the phenomenon. The Salish Sea is fed by the Fraser River, which carries a massive load of silt and debris into the ocean. When a body enters the water, whether through suicide, accident, or foul play, it typically sinks to the bottom due to the weight of the skeleton and the lack of air in the lungs initially. Over time, decomposition takes hold. Marine scavengers, such as crabs, shrimp, and fish, feed on the softer tissues of the body. Interestingly, the feet are often protected by durable, buoyant modern running shoes, which act as a flotation device once the ligaments and tissues connecting them to the ankle decompose and sever naturally. The fibers of the shoe trap air, and the lightweight foam soles keep the foot buoyant, allowing it to rise to the surface. Because the shoes are designed to be durable, they protect the foot from being completely consumed by scavengers, while the rest of the body, often heavier or clothed in garments that decompose or sink, remain submerged or is scattered by currents. This bloom and float theory explains why feet specifically are found, rather than hands or other limbs, as shoes are generally more buoyant and worn on the feet than gloves are on hands. Despite the scientific consensus, the sheer number of feet appearing in such a concentrated geographic area remains statistically unusual. The BC Coroner Service has worked tirelessly to identify the remains, utilizing DNA analysis, fingerprint records, and physical characteristics of the shoes to match the feet to missing persons reports. Through these efforts, the mystery has slowly been demystified, revealing that most of the feet belong to individuals who died by suicide or accidentally fell from bridges and boats. For instance, one of the feet was identified as belonging to a man who had jumped from a Patullo Bridge in New Westminster, a known location for suicides. Another was linked to a woman who had gone missing from a vessel in distress. The identification process has brought closure to some families, confirming long-held fears that their loved ones had perished in the water, but it has also highlighted the tragic reality of how many people disappear into the vastness of the Pacific Northwest waterways. However, not every foot has been identified, and not every case is easily explained away by accidental death. One of the most chilling cases involved the discovery of two right feet, one in a men's size 10 hiking boot and another in a men's size 11 running shoe, found on different islands on the same day in August 2008. The statistical improbability of 2 feet washing up simultaneously reignited fears of a serial killer. Furthermore, the fact that the feet found are almost exclusively right feet, or pairs found in close proximity, has fed the conspiracy that someone is keeping the left feet as souvenirs. While forensic experts argue that this is likely a statistical anomaly or a result of how bodies are carried by currents, the symmetry of the discoveries is undeniably eerie. The cases that remain unidentified keep the door ajar for more sinister possibilities. Could these be the victims of organized crime, dumped in the ocean with weights that eventually corroded or detached, leaving only the buoyant feet to surface? The investigation has been complicated by the international nature of the Salish Sea. Feet have washed up on both the Canadian side and the American side, requiring cooperation between the RCMP, the BC Coroner Service, and various law enforcement agencies in Washington state, including the King County Medical Examiner's Office. Jurisdictional hurdles and the sheer passage of time have made it difficult to maintain a unified investigative strategy. In some cases, the feet are found months, if not years, after the person is believed to have died, eroding the quality of DNA evidence. Yet, the advancements in genetic genealogy have offered new hope. By extracting DNA profiles from the bone and tissue inside the shoes, investigators have been able to build family trees and match them to distant relatives, solving cases that had gone cold for over a decade. The human element of the story is often lost in the sensationalism of severed feet. Behind each shoe is a person, a father, a daughter, a brother, who was loved and missed. For the families, the discovery of the foot is a double-edged sword. It provides a tangible proof of death they needed to stop searching, but also delivers a finality in a horrific and gruesome package. The media frenzy surrounding the finds often re-traumatizes the families, turning their personal tragedy into a global spectacle of speculation. The narrative shifts from the person they love to the mystery of the foot, stripping away the individuality of the victim. The coroners and detectives involved in the case have been careful to treat the remains with respect, emphasizing that these are not props in a horror movie, but the final remains of human beings who met tragic ends. One particularly poignant case involved the discovery of a foot in a shoe that was easily traceable to a specific limited edition release, which helped narrow down the time frame of when the shoe was purchased. This detail, combined with a distinct or pattern on the sole, allowed investigators to link the foot to a missing young man who had been struggling with mental health issues. The identification brought a somber resolution to his parents, who had spent years wondering what had happened to their son after he walked out of the house one evening and never returned. It confirmed the tragedy they feared, but also allowed them to finally lay him to rest, a closure that would not have been possible without the grim discovery on the beach. The environmental factors of the region also play a crucial role in the mystery. The Salish Sea is a semi-enclosed basin with complex current patterns that can trap floating debris for extended periods before spitting out onto a beach. This retention effect means that a foot that separates from a body in the middle of the sea might not wash ashore for years, traveling in a slow, circular route dictated by the tides and winds. This explains why the discoveries have been spread out over such a long period and why they continue to appear sporadically. It is not that the rate of foot detachments is increasing, but rather that the ocean is slowly releasing its accumulated bounty. The pattern of discoveries is dictated by the oceanography of the region as much as by the causes of death. Despite the rational explanations, the cultural impact of the severed feet phenomenon is undeniable. It has inspired novels, documentaries, and episodes of television shows like The X-Files, cementing its place in the folklore of the Pacific Northwest. The image of the lone shoe on the sand is a powerful visual metaphor for the unknown, for the secrets that the ocean refuses to give up. It taps into a primal fear of the deep and the unknowable. While scientists and police may lean toward the theory of natural decomposition, the public imagination often drifts towards the darker possibilities, perhaps because the truth of suicide and accidental drowning is too bleak and mundane to satisfy the human appetite for mystery. In the end, the severed feet mystery is not a single event, but a series of tragedies connected by the chemistry of decomposition and the physics of ocean currents. It is a window into the hidden world of the missing, a reminder of the vastness of the sea and its ability to conceal the dead. While most of the cases have been solved or attributed to non-criminal causes, the remaining unidentified feet serve as a lingering challenge to investigators and a somber memorial to those whose names are still unknown. As long as shoes continue to float and tides continue to shift, the beaches of the Salish Sea may yet yield more secrets, keeping the mystery alive in the gray mist where the forest meets the sea. The feet that wash ashore are the final messengers of the lost, telling stories that no one else could hear, stories that end on the sand with the discovery of a shoe and a question mark.